Good afternoon, pretty shiny peoples. Okay, I know I missed another week. I'm so sorry. Bunch of stuff going on, but hopefully we will get back to regular soon. I know I will miss one mid-March. As always, please forgive the background noise and dogs and all of that, because this is not pre-recorded. We're still on book 3. The books are getting longer. So we're still on book 3, but the good news is I think after today we'll have 2 more weeks and then we'll be on book 4. So that is good news. Yes, okay, and book 4 will be Wizard and Glass. But right now we are on Bridge and City of the Wastelands. One moment, I'm going to get a drink of water and then we will begin. They came upon the downed airplane 3 days later. Jake pointed it out first at mid-morning, a flash of light about 10 miles away as if a mirror lay in the grass. As they drew closer, they saw a large, dark object at the side of the great road. It looks like a dead bird, Roland said. A big one. That's no bird, Eddie said. That's an airplane. I'm pretty sure the glare is sunlight bouncing off the canopy. An hour later, they stood silently at the edge of the road, looking at the ancient wreck. 3 plump crows stood on the tattered skin of the fuselage, staring insolently at the newcomers. Jake pried a cobble from the edge of the road and shied it at them. The crows lumbered into the air, cawing indignantly. One wing had broken off in the crash and lay 30 yards away, a shadow like a diving board in the tall grass. The rest of the plane was pretty much intact. The canopy had cracked in a starburst pattern where the pilot's head had struck it. There was a large, rust-colored stain there. Oy trotted over to where the 3 rusty propeller blades rose from the grass, sniffed at them, then returned hastily to Jake. The man in the cockpit was a dust-dry mummy wearing a padded leather vest and a helmet with a spike on top. His lips were gone, his teeth exposed in a final desperate grimace. Fingers which had once been as long as sausages but were now only skin-covered bones clutched the wheel. His skull was caved in where it had hit the canopy, and Roland guessed that the greenish-gray scales which coated the left side of his face were all that remained of his brains. The dead man's head was tilted back, as if he had been sure, even at the moment of his death, that he could regain the sky again. The plane's remaining wing still jutted from the encroaching grass. On it was a faded insignia which depicted a fist holding a thunderbolt. Looks like Aunt Talitha was wrong, and the old albino man had the right of it after all, Susanna said in an awed voice. That must be David Quick. The outlaw prince. Look at the size of him, Roland. They must have had to grease him to get him into the cockpit. Roland nodded. The heat and the years had wasted the man and the mechanical bird to no more than a skeleton wrapped in dry hide, but he could still see how broad the shoulders had been, and the misshapen head was massive. So fell Lord Perth, he said, and the countryside did shake with that thunder. Jake looked at him questioningly. It's from an old poem. Lord Perth was a giant who went forth to war with 1,000 men, but he was still in his own country when a little boy threw a stone at him, and it hit him in the knee. He stumbled, and the weight of his armor bore him down, and he broke his neck in the fall. Jake said, like our story of David and Goliath. There was no fire, Eddie said. I bet he just ran out of gas and tried a dead stick landing on the road. He might have been an outlaw and a barbarian, but he had a yard of guts. Roland nodded and looked at Jake. You all right with this? Yes. If the guy was still, runny, I might not be. Jake looked from the dead man in the airplane to the city. Lud was much closer and clearer now, and although they could see many broken windows in the towers, he, like Eddie, had not entirely given up hope of finding some sort of help there. I bet things sort of fell apart in the city once he was gone. I think you'd win that bet, Roland said. You know something? Jake was studying the plane again. The people who build that city might have made their own airplanes, but I'm pretty sure this is one of ours. I did a school paper on an air combat when I was in the 5th grade, and I think I recognize it. Roland, can I take a closer look? Roland nodded. I'll go with you. Together they walked over to the plane with the high grass swishing at their pants. Look, Jake said. See the machine gun under the wing? That's an air-cooled German model, and this is a Focke-Wulf from just before World War II. I'm sure it is. So what's it doing here? Lots of planes disappear, Eddie said. Take the Bermuda Triangle, for instance. That's a place over one of our oceans, Roland. It's supposed to be jinxed. Maybe it's a big doorway between our worlds, one that's almost always open. Eddie hunched his shoulders and essayed a bad Rod Serling imitation. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare for turbulence. You're flying into the Roland zone. Jake and Roland, who were now standing beneath the plane's remaining wing, ignored him. Boost me up, Roland. Roland shook his head. That wing looks solid, but it's not. This thing has been here a long time, Jake. You'd fall. Make a step, then. Eddie said, I'll do it, Roland. Roland studied his diminished right hand for a moment, shrugged, then laced his hands together. This'll do. He's light. Jake shook off his moccasin and stepped lightly into the stirrup Roland had made. Oy began to bark shrilly, though whether in excitement or alarm, Roland couldn't tell. Jake's chest was now pressing against one of the airplane's rusty flaps, and he was looking right at the fist and thunderbolt design. It had peeled up a little from the surface of the wing along one edge. He seized this flap and pulled. He came off the wing so easily that he would have fallen backward if Eddie, standing directly behind him, hadn't steadied him with a hand on the butt. I knew it, Jake said. There was another symbol beneath the fist and thunderbolt, and now it was almost totally revealed. It was a swastika. I just wanted to see it. You can put me down now. They started out again, but they could see the tail of the plane every time they looked back that afternoon, looming out of the high grass like Lord Perth's burial monument. It was Jake's turn to make fire that night. When the wood was laid to the gunslinger's satisfaction, he handed Jake his flint and steel. Let's see how you do it. Eddie and Susanna were sitting off to one side, their arms linked companionably about each other's waist. Toward the end of the day, Eddie had found a bright yellow flower beside the road and had picked it for her. Tonight, Susanna was wearing it in her hair, and every time she looked at Eddie, her lips curved into a small smile and her eyes filled with light. Roland had noted these things, and they pleased him. Their love was deepening, strengthening. That was good. It would have to be deep and strong indeed if it was to survive the months and years ahead. Jake struck a spark, but it flashed inches away from the kindling. Move your flint in closer, Roland said, and hold it steady. And don't hit it with the steel, Jake. Scrape it. Jake tried again, and this time the spark flashed directly into the kindling. There was a little tendril of smoke, but no fire. I don't think I'm very good at this. You'll get it. Meantime, think on this. What's dressed when the night falls and undressed when the day breaks? Huh? Roland moved Jake's hand closer to the little pile of kindling. I guess that one's not in your book. Oh, it's a riddle. Jake struck another spark. This time a small flame glowed in the kindling before dying out. You know some of those too? Roland nodded. Not just some, a lot. As a boy I must have known 1,000. They were part of my studies. Really? Why would anyone study riddles? Vinay, my tutor, said a boy who could answer a riddle was a boy who could think around corners. We had riddling contests every Friday noon, and the boy or girl who won could leave school early. Did you get to leave early often, Roland? Susanna asked. He shook his head, smiling a little himself. I enjoyed riddling, but I was never very good at it. Vinay said it was because I thought too deeply. My father said it was because I had too little imagination. I think they were both right, but I think my father had a little more of the truth. I could always haul a gun faster than any of my mates and shoot straighter, but I've never been much good at thinking around corners. Susanna, who had watched closely as Roland dealt with the old people of River Crossing, thought the gunslinger was underrating himself, but she said nothing. Sometimes on winter nights, there would be riddling competitions in the great hall. When it was just the Yonkers, Elaine always won. When the grown-ups played as well, it was always Court. He'd forgotten more riddles than the rest of us ever knew, and after the fair day riddling, Court always carried home the goose. Riddles have great power, and everyone knows one or two. Even me, Eddie said. For instance, why did the dead baby cross the road? That's dumb, Eddie, Susanna said, but she was smiling. Because it was stapled to the chicken, Eddie yelled and grinned when Jake burst into laughter, knocking his little pile of kindling apart. Got a million of 'em, folks. Roland, however, didn't laugh. He looked, in fact, a trifle offended. Pardon me for saying so, Eddie, but that is rather silly. Jesus, Roland, I'm sorry, Eddie said. He was still smiling, but he sounded slightly peeved. I keep forgetting you got your sense of humor shot off in the Children's Crusade or whatever it was. It's just that I take riddling seriously. I was taught that the ability to solve them indicates a sane and rational mind. Well, they're never going to replace the works of Shakespeare or the quadratic equation, Eddie said. I mean, let's not get carried away. Jake was looking at Roland thoughtfully. My book said riddling is the oldest game people still play. In our world, I mean. And riddles used to be very serious business, not just jokes. People used to get killed over them. Roland was looking out into the growing darkness. Yes, I've seen it happen. He was remembering a fair day riddling which had ended not with the giving of the prize goose, but with a cross-eyed man in a cap of bells dying in the dirt with a dagger in his chest. Court's dagger. The man had been a wandering singer and acrobat who had attempted to cheat Court by stealing the judge's pocketbook in which the answers were kept on small scraps of bark. Well, excuse me, Eddie said. Susanna was looking at Jake. I forgot all about the book of riddles you carried over. May I look at it now? Sure, it's in my pack. The answers are gone, though. Maybe that's why Mr. Tower gave it to me for His shoulder was suddenly seized with a painful force. What was his name? Roland asked. Mr. Tower, Jake said. Calvin Tower. Didn't I tell you that? No. Roland slowly relaxed his grip on Jake's shoulder. But now that I hear it, I suppose I'm not surprised. Eddie had opened Jake's pack and found Riddled Dumb. He tossed it to Susanna. You know, he said, I always thought that dead baby joke was pretty good. Tasteless, maybe. Pretty good. I don't care about taste, Roland said. It's senseless and unsolvable, and that's what makes it silly. A good riddle is neither. Jesus, you guys did take this stuff seriously, didn't you? Yes. Meanwhile, Jake had been restacking the kindling and mulling over the riddle which had started the discussion. Now he suddenly smiled. A fire. That's the answer, right? Dress it at night, undress it in the morning. If you change dress to build, it's simple. That's it. Roland returned Jake's smile, but his eyes were on Susanna, watching as she thumbed through the small, tattered book. He thought, looking at her studious frown and the absent way she read, just did the yellow flower in her hair when it tried to slip free, that she alone might sense that the tattered book of riddles could be as important as Charlie the Choo-Choo, maybe more important. He looked from her to Eddie and felt a recurrence of his irritation at Eddie's foolish riddle. The young man bore another resemblance to Cuthbert, this one rather unfortunate. Roland sometimes felt like shaking him until his nose bled and his teeth fell out. Soft, gunslinger, soft. Court's voice, not quite laughing, spoke up in his head, and Roland resolutely put his emotions at arm's length. It was easier to do that when he remembered that Eddie couldn't help his occasional forays into nonsense. Character was also at least partly formed by Ka, and Roland knew well that there was more to Eddie than nonsense. Any time he started to make the mistake of thinking that wasn't so, he would do well to remember their conversation by the side of the road 3 nights before, when Eddie had accused him of using them as markers on his own private game board. That had angered him. but it had been close enough to the truth to shame him as well. Blissfully unaware of these long thoughts, Eddie now inquired, "What's green, weighs 100 tons, and lives at the bottom of the ocean?" "I know," Jake said. "Moby Snot, the great green whale." "Idiocy," Roland muttered. "Yeah, but that's what's supposed to make it funny," Eddie said. "Jokes are supposed to make you think around corners too, you see?" He looked at Roland's face, laughed, and threw up his hands. "Never mind. I give up. You wouldn't understand. Not in a million years. Let's look at the damned book. I'll even try to take it seriously. If we can eat a little supper first, that is." "Watch me," the gunslinger said, with the flicker of a smile. "Huh? That means you have a deal." Jake scraped the steel across the flint. A spark jumped, and this time the kindling caught fire. He sat back contentedly and watched the flames spread, one arm slung around Oi's neck. He felt well pleased with himself. He had started the evening fire, and he had guessed the answer to Roland's riddle. "I've got one," Jake said as they ate their evening burritos. "Is it a foolish one?" Roland asked. "Nah, it's a real one." "Then try me with it." "Okay. What can run but never walks, has a mouth but never talks, has a bed but never sleeps, has a head but never weeps?" "A good one," Roland said kindly, "but an old one. A river." Jake was a little crestfallen. "You really are hard to stump." Roland tossed the last bite of his burrito to Oi, who accepted it eagerly. "Not me. I'm what Eddie calls an overpush. You should have seen Elaine. He collected riddles the way ladies collect fans." "That's pushover, Roland, old buddy," Eddie said. "Thank you. Try this one. What lies in bed What lies in bed and stands in bed, first white, then red. The plumper it gets, the better the old woman likes it." Eddie burst out laughing. "A dork," he yelled. "Crude, Roland, but I like it. I like it." Roland shook his head. "Your answer is wrong. A good riddle is sometimes a puzzle in words, like Jake's about the river, but sometimes it's more like a magician's trick, making you look in one direction while it's going somewhere else." "It's a double," Jake said. He explained what Aaron Depno had said about the riddle of Samson. Roland nodded. "Is it a strawberry?" Susanna asked, and then answered her own question. "Of course it is. It's like the fire riddle. There's a metaphor hidden inside it. Once you understand the metaphor, you can solve the riddle." "I metaphor sex, but she slapped my face and walked away when I asked," Eddie told them sadly. They all ignored him. "If you change gets to grows," Susanna went on, "it's easy. First white, then red. Plumper it grows, the better the old woman likes it." She looked pleased with herself, and Roland nodded. "The answer I always heard was a whenberry, but I'm sure both answers mean the same thing." Eddie picked up Riddle-de-Dum and began flipping through it. "How about this one, Roland? When is a door not a door?" Roland frowned. "Is it another piece of your stupidity? Because my patience—" "No, I promised to take it seriously, and I am. I'm trying, at least. It's in this book, and I just happen to know the answer. I heard it when I was a kid." Jake, who also knew the answer, winked at Eddie. Eddie winked back, and it was amused to see Oi also trying to wink. The bumbler kept shutting both eyes and eventually gave up. Roland and Susanna, meanwhile, were puzzling over the question. "It must have something to do with love," Roland said. A door, when is a door not a door? Oi said. His imitation of Roland's thoughtful tone was perfect. Eddie winked at Jake again. Jake covered his mouth to hide a smile. "Is the answer false love?" Roland asked at last. "Nope." "Window?" Susanna said suddenly and decisively. "When is a door not a door? When it's a window." "Nope." Eddie was grinning broadly now. But Jake was struck by how far from the real answer both of them had wandered. There was magic at work here, he thought. Pretty common stuff is magic wet, no flying carpets or disappearing elephants, but magic all the same. He suddenly saw what they were doing, a simple game of riddles around a campfire, in an entirely new light. It was like playing blind man's bluff, only in this game, the blindfold was made of words. I give up, Susanna said. Yes, Roland said. Tell if you know. The answer is ajar. A door is not a door when it's ajar. Get it? Eddie watched as comprehension dawned on Roland's face and asked, a little apprehensively, Is it a bad one? I was trying to be serious this time, Roland. Really, not bad at all. On the contrary, it's quite good. Court would have gotten it, I'm sure. Probably Elaine, too. It's still very clever. I did what I always used to do in the schoolroom, made it more complicated than it really was, and shot right past the answer. There really is something to it, isn't there? Eddie mused. Roland nodded, but Eddie didn't see. He was looking into the depths of the fire where dozens of roses bloomed and faded in the coals. Roland said, One more and we'll turn in. Only from tonight on, we'll stand a watch. You first, Eddie, then Susanna. I'll take the last one. What about me? Jake asked. Later on, you might have to take a turn. Right now, it's more important for you to get your sleep. Do you really think sentry duty is necessary? Susanna asked. I don't know, and that's the best reason of all to do it. Jake, choose us a riddle from your book. Eddie handed Riddle-dee-Dum to Jake, who thumbed through the pages and finally stopped near the back. Whoa, this one's a killer. Let's hear it, Eddie said. If I don't get it, Suze will. We're known at fair days all across the land as Eddie Dean and his Riddling Queen. We're witty tonight, ain't we? Susanna said. Let's see how witty you are after setting up by the side of the road until midnight or so, honey child. Jake read. There is a thing that nothing is, and yet it has a name. It's sometimes tall and sometimes short, joins our talks, joins our sport, and plays at every game. They discussed this riddle for almost 15 minutes, but none of them could even hazard an answer. Maybe it'll come to one of us while we're asleep, Jake said. That's how I got the one about the river. Cheap book with the answers torn out, Eddie said. He stood up and wrapped a hide blanket around his shoulders like a cloak. Well, it was cheap. Mr. Tower gave it to me for free. What am I looking for, Roland? Eddie asked. Roland shrugged as he laid down. I don't know, but I think you'll know it if you see it or hear it. Wake me up when you start feeling sleepy, Susanna said. You better believe it. A grassy ditch ran along the side of the road, and Eddie sat on the far side of it with his blanket around his shoulders. A thin scud of clouds had veiled the sky tonight, dimming the star show. A strong west wind was blowing. When Eddie turned his face in the direction, he could clearly smell the buffalo which now owned these plains. A mixed perfume of hot fur and fresh dung. The clarity which had returned to his senses in these last few months was amazing, and at times like these, a little spooky as well. Very faintly, he could hear a buffalo calf bawling. He turned toward the city, and after a while he began to think he might be seeing distant sparks of light there, the electric candles of the twin story, but he was well aware that he might be seeing nothing more than his own wishful thinking. You're a long way from 42nd Street, sweetheart. Hope it's a great thing, no matter what anyone says, but don't hope so hard you lose sight of that one thought. You're a long way from 42nd Street. That's not New York up ahead, no matter how much you wish it was. That's Lud, and it'll be whatever it is, and if you keep that in mind, maybe you'll be okay. He passed this time on watch, trying to think of an answer to the last riddle of the evening. The scolding Roland had given him about his dead baby joke had left him feeling disgruntled, and it would please him to be able to start off the morning by giving them a good answer. Of course, They wouldn't be able to check any answer against the back of the book, but he had an idea that with good riddles, a good answer was usually self-evident. Sometimes tall and sometimes short. He thought that was the key, and the rest was probably just misdirection. What was sometimes tall and sometimes short? Pants? No. Pants were sometimes short and sometimes long, but he had never heard of tall pants. Tails? Like pants, it only fit snugly one way. Drinks were both tall and short. Order, he murmured, and thought for a moment that he must have stumbled across the solution. Both adjectives fit the noun glove tight. A tall order was a big job, and a short order was something you got on the quick in the restaurant, a hamburger or a tuna melt, except that tall orders and tuna melts didn't join our talk or play at evening games. He felt a rush of frustration and had to smile at himself, getting all wound up about a harmless word game in a kid's book. All the same, he found it a little easier to believe that people might really kill each other over riddles, if the stakes were high enough and cheating was involved. Let it go. You're doing exactly what Roland said, thinking right past it. Still, what else did he have to think about? Then, the drumming from the city began again, and he did have something else. There was no build-up. At one moment it wasn't there, and at the next it was going full force, as if a switch had been turned. Eddie walked to the edge of the road, turned toward the city, and listened. After a few moments he looked around to see if the drums had awakened the others, but he was still alone. He turned toward Lud again and cupped his ears forward with the sides of his hands. Bump, ba-bum, ba-bum, bum, bump. Eddie became more and more sure that he had been right about what it was, that he at least solved this riddle. The idea that he was standing by a deserted road in an almost empty world, standing some 170 miles from a city which had been built by some fabulous lost civilization and listening to a rock and roll drum line, that was crazy. But was it any crazier than a traffic light that dinged and dropped a rusty green flag with the word "Go" printed on it? Any crazier than discovering the wreck of a German plane from the 1930s? Eddie sang the words to a ZZ Top song in a whisper. You need just enough of that sticky stuff to hold the seam on your fine blue jeans. I say, yeah, yeah. They fit the beat perfectly. It was the disco pulse perfection of Velcro Fly. Eddie was sure of it. A short time later the sound ceased as suddenly as it began, and he could hear only wind, and more faintly the Send River, which had a bed but never slept. The next 4 days were uneventful. They walked, they watched the bridge and the city grow larger and to find themselves more clearly. They camped, they ate, they riddled. They kept watch, turn and turn about. Jake had pestered Roland into letting him keep a short watch in the 2 hours just before dawn. They slept. The only remarkable incident had to do with the bees. Around noon on the third day of the discovery of the downed plane, a buzzing sound came to them, growing louder and louder until it dominated the day. At last Roland stopped. There, he said, and pointed to the grove of eucalyptus trees. It sounds like bees, Susanna said. Roland's faded blue eyes gleamed. Could be we'll have a little dessert tonight. I don't know how to tell you this, Roland, Eddie said, but I have this aversion to being stung. Don't we all? Roland agreed. But the day is windless. I think we can smoke them to sleep and steal their comb right out from under them without setting half of the world on fire. Let's have a look. He carried Susanna, who was as eager for the adventure as the gunslinger himself, toward the grove. Eddie and Jake lagged behind, and Oy, apparently having decided that discretion was the better part of valor, remained sitting at the edge of the great road, panting like a dog and watching them carefully. Roland paused at the edge of the trees. Stay where you are, he told Eddie and Jake, speaking softly. We're going to have a look. I'll give you a come on if all's well. He carried Susanna into the dappled shadows of the grove while Eddie and Jake remained in the sunshine, peering after them. It was cooler in the shade. The buzzing of the bees was a steady, hypnotic drone. There are too many, Roland murmured. This is late summer. They should be out working. I don't. He caught sight of the hive bulging tumorously from the hollow of a tree in the center of the clearing and broke off. "What's the matter with them?" Susanna asked in a soft, horrified voice. "Roland, what's the matter with them?" A bee, as plump and slow-moving as a horsefly in October, droned past her head. Susanna flinched away from it. Roland motioned for the others to join them. They did, and stood looking at the hive without speaking. The chambers weren't neat hexagons, but random holes of all shapes and sizes. The beehive itself looked queerly melted, as if someone had turned a blowtorch on it. The bees which crawled sluggishly over it were as white as snow. "No honey tonight," Roland said. "What we took from yonder comb might taste sweet, but it would poison us as surely as night follows day." One of the grotesque white bees lumbered heavily past Jake's head. He ducked away with an expression of loathing. "What did it?" Eddie asked. "What did it to them, Roland?" "The same thing that has emptied this whole land. The thing that's still causing many of the buffalo to be born as sterile freaks. I've heard it called the Old War, the Great Fire, the Cataclysm, and the Great Poisoning. Whatever it was the start of all our troubles, and it happened long ago, 1,000 years before the great-great-grandfathers of the river-crossing folk were born. The physical effects, the two-headed buffalo and the white bees and such, have grown less as time passes. I have seen this for myself. The other changes are greater, if harder to see, and they are still going on." They watched the white bees crawl, dazed and almost completely helpless about their hive. Some were apparently trying to work, most simply wandering about, butting heads and crawling over one another. Eddie found himself remembering a news clip he'd seen once. It had shown a crowd of survivors leaving the area where a gas main had exploded, flattening almost a whole city block in some California town. These bees reminded him of those dazed, shell-shocked survivors. "You had a nuclear war, didn't you?" he asked, almost accused. "These great old ones you like to talk about, they blew their great old asses straight to hell, didn't they?" "I don't know what happened. No one knows. The records of those times are lost, and a few stories are confused and conflicting." "Let's get out of here," Jake said in a trembling voice. "Looking at those things makes me sick." "I'm with you, sugar," Susanna said. So they left the bees to their aimless, shattered life in the grove of ancient trees, and there was no honey that night. "When are you going to tell us what you do know?" Eddie asked the next morning. The day was bright and blue, but there was a bite in the air. The first autumn in this world was almost upon them. Roland glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "I'd like to hear your whole story from beginning to end, starting with Gilead. How you grew up there and what happened to end it all. I want to know how you found out about the Dark Tower and why you started chasing after it in the first place. I want to know about your first bunch of friends, too, and what happened to them." Roland removed his hat, armed sweat from his brow, and then replaced it. "You have the right to know all those things, I suppose, and I'll tell them to you, but not now. It's a very long story. I never expected to tell it to anyone, and I'll only tell it once." "When?" Eddie persisted. "When the time is right," Roland said. And with that, they had to be content. Roland came awake the moment before Jake began to shake him. He sat up and looked around, but Eddie and Susanna were still fast asleep, and in the first faint light of the morning he could see nothing amiss. "What is it?" he asked Jake in a low voice. "I don't know. Fighting, maybe? Come and listen." Roland threw his blanket aside and followed Jake out to the road. He reckoned they were now only 3 days' walk from the place where the Send passed in front of the city, and the bridge, built squarely along the path of the beam, dominated the horizon. Its pronounced tilt was more clearly visible than ever, and he could see at least a dozen gaps where overstressed cables had snapped like strings of a lyre. Tonight the wind blew directly into their faces, and as they looked toward the city, and the sounds it carried to them were faint but clear. "Is it fighting?" Jake asked. Roland nodded and held a finger to his lips. He heard faint shouts, a crash that sounded like some huge object falling, and, of course, the drums. Now there was another crash, this one more musical, the sound of breaking glass. "Jeepers," Jake whispered, and moved closer to the gunslinger. Then came the sounds which Roland had hoped not to hear, a fast, sandy rattle of small arms fire, followed by a loud, hollow bang, clearly an explosion of some kind. It rolled across the flatlands toward them like an invisible bowling ball. After that, the shouts, thuds, and sounds of breakage quickly sank below the level of drums, and when the drums quit a few minutes later with their usual unsettling suddenness, the city was silent again. But now the silence held an unpleasant, waiting quality. Roland put an arm around Jake's shoulder. "Still not too late to detour around," he said. Jake glanced up at him. "We can't." "Because of the train?" Jake nodded and sing-songed. "Blaine is a pain, but we have to take the train, and the city's the only place where we can get on." Roland looked thoughtfully at Jake. "Why do you say we have to? Is it Ka?" "Because, Jake, you have to understand that you don't know much about Ka yet. It's the sort of subject men study all their lives. I don't know if it's Ka or not, but I do know that we can't go into the wastelands unless we're protected, and that means Blaine. Without him, we'll die, like those bees we saw are going to die when the winter comes. We have to be protected, because the wastelands are poison." "How do you know these things?" "I don't know," Jake said, almost angrily. "I just do." "All right," Roland said mildly. He looked toward Lud again. "But we'll have to be damned careful. It's unlikely that they still have gunpowder. If they have that, they may have things that are even more powerful. I doubt if they know how to use them, but that only increases the danger. They could get excited and blow us all to hell." "El," a grave voice said from behind them. They glanced around and saw Oy sitting by the side of the road, watching them. Later that day they came to a new road which swept toward them out of the west and joined their own way. Beyond this point, the great road, now much wider and split down the middle of the median divider of some polished dark stone, began to sink, and the crumbling concrete embankments which rose on either side of them gave the pilgrims a claustrophobic, trapped feeling. They stood at a point where one of those concrete dikes had been broken open, affording a comforting line of sight to the open land beyond, and ate a light, unsatisfying meal. "Why do you think they dropped the road down like this?" Eddie said. Eddie, Jake asked. "I mean, someone did do it that way on purpose, didn't they?" Eddie looked through the break in the concrete where the flatland stretched out as smoothly as ever and nodded. "Then why?" "Don't know, champ," Eddie said, but he thought he did. He glanced at Roland and guessed that he knew too. The sunken road leading to the bridge had been a defensive measure. Troops placed atop the concrete slopes were in control of two carefully engineered redoubts. If the defenders didn't like the look of the folks approaching Lud along the great road, they could rain destruction down on them. "You sure you don't know?" Jake asked. Eddie smiled at Jake and tried to stop imagining that there was some nut up there right now getting ready to roll a large, rusty bomb down one of those decayed concrete ramps. "No idea," he said. Susanna whistled disgustedly between her teeth. "This road's going to hell, Roland. I was hoping we were done with that damn harness, but you better get it out again." He nodded and rummaged in his purse for it without a word. The condition of the great road deteriorated as other, smaller roads joined it like tributaries joining a great river. As they neared the bridge, the cobbles were replaced with a surface Roland thought of as metal and the rest of them thought of as asphalt or hot top. It had not held up as well as the cobbles. Time had done some damage. The passage of countless horses and wagons since the last repairs were made had done more. The surface had been chewed into treacherous rubble. Foot travel would be difficult, and the idea of pushing Susanna's wheelchair over that crumbled surface was ridiculous. The banks on either side had grown steadily steeper, and now, at their tops, they could see slim, pointed shapes looming against the sky. Roland thought of arrowheads, huge ones, weapons made by a tribe of giants. To his companions, they looked like rockets or guided missiles. Susanna thought of redstones fired from Cape Canaveral. Eddie thought about SAMs, some built to be fired from the back of flatbed trucks stored all over Europe. Jake thought of ICBMs hiding in reinforced concrete silos under the plains of Kansas and the unpopulated mountains of Nevada, programmed to hit back at China or the USSR in the event of nuclear Armageddon. All of them felt as if they had passed into a dark and woeful zone of shadow or into the countryside laboring under some old but still powerful curse. Some hours after they entered this area, Jake called it the Gauntlet. Concrete embankments ended at a place where half a dozen access roads drew together, like the strands of a spider web, and here the land opened out again. A fact which relieved all of them, although none of them said so out loud. Another traffic light swung over the junction, this one more familiar to Eddie and Susanna and Jake. It had once had lenses on its four faces, although the glass had been broken out long ago. I'll bet this road was the eighth wonder of the world once upon a time, Susanna said. And look at it now. It's a minefield. Old ways are sometimes the best ways, Roland agreed. Eddie was pointing west. Look. Now that the high concrete barriers were gone, they could see exactly what old Cy had described to them over cups of bitter coffee in River Crossing. One track only, he had said, set up high on a column of man-made stone, such as the old ones used to make their streets and walls. The track raced toward them out of the west in a slim, straight line, then flowed across the sand and into the city on a narrow golden trestle. It was a simple, elegant construction, and the only one they had seen so far, which was totally without rust, but it was badly marred all the same. Halfway across, a large piece of the trestle had fallen into the rushing river below. What remained were two long, jutting piers that pointed at each other like accusing fingers. Jutting out of the water below the hole was a streamlined tube of metal. Once it had been bright blue, but now the color had been dimmed by spreading scales of rust. It looked very small from this distance. So much for Blaine, Eddie said. No wonder they stopped hearing it. The supports finally gave way while it was crossing the river, and it fell in the drink. It must have been decelerating when it happened, or it would have carried straight across. And we'd see would be a big hole, like a bomb crater in the far bank. Well, it was a great idea while it lasted. Mercy said there was another one, Susanna reminded him. Yeah. She also said she hadn't heard it in 7 or 8 years, and Aunt Talitha said it was more like 10. What do you think, Jake? Jake? Earth to Jake. Earth to Jake. Come in, little buddy. Jake, who had been staring intently at the remains of the train in the river, only shrugged. You're a big help, Jake, Eddie said. Valuable input. That's why I love you. Why we all love you. Jake paid no attention. He knew what he was seeing, and it wasn't Blaine. The remains of the mono sticking out of the river were blue. In his dream, Blaine had been a dusty, sugary pink of the bubble gum you got with the baseball trading cards. Roland, meanwhile, had cinched the straps of Susanna's carry harness over his chest. Eddie, boost your lady into this contraption. It's time we moved on and saw for ourselves. Jake now shifted his gaze, looking nervously toward the bridge looming ahead. He could hear a high, ghostly humming noise in the distance, the sound of the wind playing in the decayed steel hangers which connected the overhead cables to the concrete deck below. Do you think it'll be safe to cross? Jake asked. We'll find out tomorrow, Roland replied. The next morning, Roland's band of travelers stood at the end of the long, rusty bridge, gazing across at Lud. Eddie dreams of wise old elves who had preserved a working technology on which the pilgrims could draw were disappearing. Now that they were this close, he could see holes in the cityscape where whole blocks of buildings had appeared to have been either burned or blasted. The skyline reminded him of a diseased jaw from which many teeth have already fallen. It was true that most of the buildings were still standing, but They had a dreary, disused look that filled Eddie with an uncharacteristic gloom, and the bridge between the travelers and that shuttered maze of steel and concrete looked anything but solid and eternal. The vertical hangars on the left sagged slackly. The ones remaining on the right almost screamed with tension. The deck had been constructed of hollow concrete boxes shaped like trapezoids. Some of these had buckled upward, displaying empty black interiors. Others had slipped askew. Many of these latter had merely cracked, but others were badly broken, leaving gaps big enough to drop big trucks, into. In places where the bottoms of the box section as well as the tops had shattered, they could see the muddy river banks and gray-green water of the Sende beyond it. Eddie put distance between the deck and the water as 300 feet at the center of the bridge, and that was probably a conservative estimate. Eddie peered at the huge concrete caissons to which the main cables were anchored and thought the one on the right side of the bridge looked as if it had been pulled part way out of the earth. He decided he might do well not to mention this fact to the others. It was bad enough that the bridge was swaying slowly but perceptibly back and forth. Just looking at it made him feel seasick. "Well," he asked Roland, "what do you think?" Roland pointed to the right side of the bridge. Here was a canted walkway about 5 feet wide. It had been constructed atop a series of smaller concrete boxes and was, in effect, a separate deck. This segmented deck appeared to be supported by an undercable, or perhaps it was a thick steel rod anchored to the main support cables by huge bow clamps. Eddie inspected the closest one with the avid interest of a man who may soon be entrusting his life to the object he is studying. The bow clamp appeared rusty, but still sound. The words Lamarck Foundry had been stamped into its metal. Eddie was fascinated to realize he no longer knew if the words were in high speech or in English. "I think we can use that," Roland said. "There's only one bad place. Do you see it?" "Yeah, it's kind of hard to miss." The bridge, which had to be at least 3/4 of a mile long, might not have had any proper maintenance for over 1,000 years, but Roland guessed that the real destruction might have been going on for only the last 50 or so. As the hangars on the right snapped, the bridge had listed farther and farther to the left. The greatest twist had occurred in the center of the bridge, between the two 400-foot cable towers. At the place where the pressure of the twist was the greatest, a gaping eye-shaped hole ran across the deck. The break in the walkway was narrower, but even so, at least 2 adjoining concrete box sections had fallen into the Sende, leaving a gap at least 20 or 30 feet wide. Where these boxes had been, they could clearly see the rusty steel rod or cable which supported the walkway. They would have to use it to get across the gap. "I think we can cross," Roland said calmly, pointing. "The gap is inconvenient, but the side rail is still there, so we'll have something to hold on to." Eddie nodded, but he could feel his heart pounding. Hard. The exposed walkway support looked like a big pipe made of jointed steel, and was probably 4 feet across at the top. In his mind's eye he could see how they would have to edge across, feet on the board, slightly curved back of the support, hands clutching the rail, while the bridge swayed slowly like a ship in a mild swell. "Jesus," he said. He tried to spit, but nothing came out. His mouth was too dry. "You sure, Roland?" "So far as I can see, it's the only way." Roland pointed downriver, and Eddie saw a second bridge. This one had fallen into the Sende long ago. The remains stuck out of the water in a rusted tangle of ancient steel. "What about you, Jake?" Susanna asked. "Hey, no problem," Jake said at once. He was actually smiling. "I hate you, kid," Eddie said. Roland was looking at Eddie with some concern. "If you feel you can't do it, say so now. Don't get halfway across and then freeze up." Eddie looked along the twisted surface of the bridge for a long time, then nodded. "I guess I can handle it. Heights have never been my favorite thing, but I'll manage." "Good." Roland surveyed them. "Soonest begun, soonest done. I'll go first with Susanna, then Jake, and Eddie's drogue. Can you handle the wheelchair?" "Hey, no problem," Eddie said giddily. "Let's go then." As soon as he stepped onto the walkway, fear filled up Eddie's hollow places like cold water, and he began to wonder if he had made a very dangerous mistake. From solid ground, the bridge seemed to be swaying only a little, but once he was actually on it, he felt as if he were standing on a pendulum of the world's biggest grandfather clock. The movement was very slow, but it was regular, and the length of the swing was much longer than he had anticipated. The walkway's surface was badly cracked and canted at least 10 degrees to the left. His feet gritted in loose piles of powdery concrete, and the low squealing sound of the box segments grinding together was constant. Beyond the bridge, the city skyline tilted slowly back and forth like the artificial horizon of the world's slowest moving video game. Overhead, the wind hummed constantly in the taut hangars. Below, the ground fell away sharply to the muddy northwest bank of the river. He was 30 feet up, then 60, then 110. Soon he would be over the water. The wheelchair banged against his left leg with every step. Something furry brushed between his feet, and he clutched madly for the rusty handrail with his right hand, barely holding in a scream. Oi went trotting past him with a brief upward glance, as if to say, "Excuse me, just passing." "Fucking dumb animal," Eddie said through his gritted teeth. He discovered that, although he didn't like looking down, he had an even greater aversion to looking at the hangars which were still managing to hold the deck, and the overhead cables together. They were sleeved with rust, and Eddie could see snarls of metal thread poking out of most. These snarls looked like metallic puffs of cotton. He knew from his Uncle Reg, he had worked, who had worked on both the George Washington and the Triborough bridges as a painter, that the hangers and overhead cables were spun from thousands of steel threads. On this bridge, the spin was finally letting go. The hangers were quite literally becoming unraveled, and as they did, the threads were snapping, one interwoven strand at a time. It's held this long, it'll hold a little longer. You think this thing's gonna fall into the river just because you're crossing it? Don't flatter yourself. He wasn't comfortable, however. For all Eddie knew, they might be the first people to attempt the crossing in decades, and the bridge, after all, would have to collapse sometime. And from the look of things, it was going to be soon. Their combined weight might be the straw that broke the camel's back. His moccasin struck a chunk of concrete, and Eddie watched, sickened but helpless to look away as the chunk fell down and down and down, turning over as it went. There was a small, very small splash when it hit the river. The freshening wind gusted and struck his shirt against his sweaty skin. The bridge groaned and swayed. Eddie tried to remove his hands from the side rail, but they seemed frozen to the pitted metal in a death grip. He closed his eyes for a moment. "You're not going to freeze. You're not. I forbid it. If you need something to look at, make it long, tall, and ugly." Eddie opened his eyes again, fixed them on the gunslinger, forced his hands to open, and began to move forward again. Roland reached the gap and looked back. Jake was 5 feet behind him. Oi was at his heels. The bumbler was crouched down with his neck stretched forward. The wind was much stronger over the river cut, and Roland could see it rippling Oi's silky fur. Eddie was about 25 feet behind Jake. His face was tightly drawn, but he was still shuffling grimly along with Susanna's collapsed wheelchair in his left hand. His right was clutching the rail like grim death. "Susanna?" "Yes," she responded at once. "Fine. Jake?" Jake looked up. He was still grinning, and the gunslinger saw there was going to be no problem there. The boy was having the time of his life. His hair blew back from his finely made brow in waves, and his eyes sparkled. He jerked one thumb up. Roland smiled and returned the gesture. "Eddie?" "Don't worry about me." Eddie appeared to be looking at Roland, but the gunslinger decided he was really looking past him at the windowless brick buildings which crowded the riverbanks at the far end of the bridge. That was all right. Given his obvious fear of heights, it was probably the best thing he could do to keep his head. "All right, I won't," Roland murmured. "We're going to cross the hole now. Susanna, sit easy. No quick movements, understand?" "Yes." "If you want to adjust your position, do it now." "I'm fine, Roland," she said calmly. I just hope Eddie will be all right. Eddie's a gunslinger now. He'll behave like one. Roland turned to the right so he was facing directly downriver and grasped the handrail. Then he began to edge out across the hole, shuffling his boots along the rusty cable. Jake waited until Roland and Susanna were part of the way across the gap, then started himself. The wind gusted and the bridge swayed back and forth, but he felt no alarm at all. He was, in fact, totally buzzed. Unlike Eddie, he'd never had any fear of heights. He liked being up here where he could see the river spread out like a steel ribbon under a sky which was beginning to cloud over. Halfway across the hole in the bridge, Roland and Susanna had reached the place where the uneven walkway resumed, and were watching the others. Jake looked back and his heart sank. They had forgotten one member of the party when they were discussing how to cross. Oi was crouched, frozen, and clearly terrified on the far side of the hole in the walkway. He was sniffing at the place where the concrete ended and the rusty curb support took over. "Come on, Oi," Jake called. "Oi," the bumbler called back, and the tremble in his hoarse voice was almost human. He stretched his long neck forward toward Jake, but didn't move. His gold-ringed eyes were huge and dismayed. Another gust of wind struck the bridge, making it sway and squall. Something twanged beside Jake's head, the sound of a guitar string which had been tightened until it snaps. The steel thread had popped out of the nearest vertical hanger, almost scratching his cheek. 10 feet away, Oi crouched miserably with his eyes fixed on Jake. "Come on," Roland shouted. "Wind's freshening. Come on, Jake." "Not without Oi." Jake began to shuffle back the way he had come. Before he had gone more than 2 steps, Oi stepped gingerly onto the support rod. The claws at the ends of his stiffly braced legs scratched at the rounded metal surface. Eddie stood behind the bumbler now, feeling helpless and scared to death. "That's it, Oi," Jake encouraged. "Come to me." "Oi! Oi! Ache! Ache!" the bumbler cried, and trotted rapidly along the rod. He had almost reached Jake when the traitorous winds gusted again. The bridge swung, Oi's claws scratched madly at the support rod for purchase, but there was none. His hind quarter slewed off the edge and into space. He tried to cling with his forepaws, but there was nothing to cling to. His rear legs ran wildly in midair. Jake let go of the rail and dived for him, aware of nothing but Oi's gold-ringed eyes. "No, Jake!" Roland and Eddie bellowed together, each from his own side of the gap, each too far away to do anything but watch. Jake hit the cable on his chest and belly. His pack bounced against his shoulder blades, and he heard his teeth click together in his head with the sound of a cue ball breaking a tight rack. The wind gusted again. He went with it, looping his right hand around the support rod and reaching for Oi with his left as he swayed out into space. The bumbler began to fall, and clamped his jaws on Jake's reaching hand as he did. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Jake screamed, but held on, held down, right arm clasping the rod, knees pressing hard against its wretched smooth surface. Oi dangled from his left hand like a circus acrobat, staring up with his gold-ringed eyes, and Jake could now see his own blood flowing along the sides of the bumbler's head in thin streams. Then the wind gusted again, and Jake began to slip outward. Eddie's fear left him. In its place came a strange yet welcome coldness. He dropped Susanna's wheelchair to the cracked cement with a clatter and raced nimbly along the support cables, not even bothering with the handrail. Jake hung head down over the gap with Oi swinging at the end of his left hand like a furry pendulum, and the boy's right hand was slipping. Eddie opened his legs, and Seat dropped to a sitting position. His undefended balls smashed painfully up into his crotch, but for the moment even this exquisite pain was news from a distant country. He seized Jake by the hair with one hand, and one strap of his pack with the other. He felt himself beginning to tilt outward, and for a nightmarish moment he thought all 3 of them were going to go over in a daisy chain. He then let go of Jake's hair and tightened his grip on the pack strap, praying the kid hadn't brought the pack at one of the cheap discount outlets. He flailed above his head for the handrail with his free hand. After an interminable moment in which their combined outward slide continued, he found it and seized it. "Roland!" he bawled. "I could use a little help here." But Roland was already there, with Susanna still perched on his back. When he bent, she locked her arms around his neck so she could drop head first from the sling. The gunslinger wrapped an arm around Jake's chest and pulled him up. When his feet were on the support rod again, Jake put his right arm around Oi's trembling body. His left hand was now an agony of fire and ice. "Let go, Oi," he gasped. "You can let go now. We're safe." For a terrible moment he didn't think the Billy Bumbler would. Then, slowly, Oi's jaws relaxed and Jake was able to pull his hand free. He was covered with blood and dotted with a ring of dark holes. "Oi," the Bumbler said feebly, and Eddie saw with wonder that the animal's strange eyes were full of tears. He stretched his neck and licked Jake's face with his bloody tongue. "That's okay," Jake said, pressing his face into his warm fur. He was crying himself, his face a mask of shock and pain. "Don't worry. That's okay. You couldn't help it, and I don't mind." Eddie was getting slowly to his feet. His face was a dirty gray, and he felt as if someone had driven a bowling ball into his guts. His left hand stole slowly to his crotch and investigated the damage there. "Cheap fucking vasectomy," he said hoarsely. "Are you going to faint, Eddie?" Roland asked. A fresh gust of wind flipped his hat from his head and into Susanna's face. She grabbed it and jammed it down all the way to his ears, giving Roland the look of a half-crazed hillbilly. "No," Eddie said. "I almost wish I could, but—" "Take a look at Jake," Susanna said. "He's really bleeding." "I'm fine," Jake said, and tried to hide his hand. Roland took it gently in his own hands before he could. Jake had sustained at least a dozen puncture wounds in the back of his hand, his palm, and his fingers. Most of them were deep. It would be impossible to tell if bones had been broken or tendons severed until Jake tried to flex the hand, and this wasn't the time or place for such experiments. Roland looked at Oi. The Billy Bumbler looked back, his expressive eyes sad and frightened. He made no effort to lick Jake's blood from his chops, although it would have been the most natural thing in the world for him to have done so. "Leave him alone," Jake said, and wrapped the encircling arm more tightly around Oi's body. "It wasn't his fault. It was my fault for forgetting him. The wind blew him off." "I'm not going to hurt him," Roland said. He was positive the Billy Bumbler wasn't rabid, but he still did not intend for Oi to taste any more of Jake's blood than he already had. As for any other diseases Oi might be carrying in his blood, well, Ka would decide, as in the end it always did. Roland pulled his neckerchief free and wiped Oi's lips and muzzle. "There," he said. "Good fellow. Good boy." "Oi," the Billy Bumbler said feebly, and Susanna, who was watching over Roland's shoulder, could have sworn she heard gratitude in that voice. Another gust of wind struck them. The weather was turning dirty and fast. "Eddie, we have to get off the bridge. Can you walk?" "No, massa, is going to shuffle." The pain in his groin and the pit of his stomach was still bad, but not quite so bad as it had been a minute ago. "All right, let's move, fast as we can." Roland turned, began to take a step, and stopped. A man was now standing on the far side of the gap, watching them expressionlessly. The newcomer had approached while their attention was focused on Jake and Oi. A crossbow was slung across his back. He wore a bright yellow scarf around his head. The ends streamed out like banners in the freshening wind. Gold hoops with crosses in the centers dangled from his ears. One eye was covered with a white silk patch. His face was blotched with purple sores, some of them open and festering. He might have been 30, 40, or 60. He held one hand high over his head. In it was something Roland could not make out, except that its shape was too regular to be a stone. Behind this apparition, the city loomed with a kind of weird clarity in the darkening day. As Eddie looked past the huddles of brick buildings on the other shore, warehouses, long since scooped empty by looters, he had no doubt, and into those shadowy canyons and stone mazes, he understood for the first time how terribly mistaken, how terribly foolish his dreams of hope and help had been. Now he saw the shattered facades and the broken roofs. Now he saw the shaggy birds' nests on cornices and in glassless, gaping windows. Now he allowed himself to actually smell the city, and the odor was not of fabulous spices and savory foods of the sort his mother had sometimes brought home from Zabar's, but rather the stink of a mattress that has caught fire, smoldering a while, and then been put out with sewer water. He suddenly understood Lud, understood it completely. The grinning pirate who had appeared while their attention was elsewhere was probably as close to a wise old elf as this broken, dying place could provide. Roland pulled his revolver. "Put it away, my cully," the man in the yellow scarf said in an accent so thick that the sense of his words was almost lost. "Put it away, my dear heart. You're a fierce Trimite, that's clear, but this time you're outmatched." The newcomer's pants were patched green velvet, and as he stood on the edge of the hole in the bridge he looked like a buccaneer at the end of the days of plunder, sick, ragged, and still dangerous. "Suppose I choose not to?" Roland asked. "Suppose I choose simply to put a bullet through your scrofulous head?" "Then I'll go to hell just enough ahead of ye to hold the door," the man in the yellow scarf said, and chuckled chummily. He wiggled the hand he held in the air. "It's all the same jolly fakement to me, one way or t'other." Roland guessed that was the truth. The man looked as if he might have a year to live at most, and the last few months of that year would probably be very unpleasant. The oozing sores on his face had nothing to do with radiation, unless Roland was badly deceived. This man was in the late stages of what the doctors called mandrus, and everyone else called whore's blossoms. Facing a dangerous man was always a bad business, but at least one could calculate the odds in such an encounter. When you were facing the dead, however, everything changed. "Do you know what I've got here, my dear ones?" the pirate asked. "Do you ken what your old friend Gasher just happens to have laid his hands on? It's a granado. Something pretty the old folks left behind, and I've already tipped its cap. For to wear one's cap before the introduction is complete would be very bad manners, so it would." He cackled happily for a moment, and then his face grew still and gave once more. All humor left him, as if a switch had been turned somewhere in his degenerating brains. "My finger is all that's holding the pin now, dearie. If you shoot me, there's going to be a very big bang. You and the cunt monkey on your back will be vaporized. The squint, too, I reckon. The young buck standing behind you and pointing that toy pistol in my face might live, but only until he hits the water. And hit it he would, because the bridge has been hanging by a thread these last 40 year, and all it'd take to finish it is one little push. So do you want to put away your iron, or shall we all toddle off to hell in the same handcart?" Roland briefly considered, trying to shoot the object Gasher called a granado out of his hand, saw how tightly the man was gripping it, and holstered his gun. "Ah, good!" Gasher cried, cheerful once more. "I knew you was a trig cove. Just looking at yer. Oh, yes, so I did." "What do you want?" Roland asked, although he thought he already knew this too. Gasher raised his free hand and pointed a dirty finger at Jake. "The squint. Gimme the squint, and the rest of you go free." "Go fuck yourself," Susanna said at once. "Why not?" the pirate cackled. "Gimme a chunk of mirror, and I'll rip it right off and stick it right in. Why not? For all the good it's doing me these days. Why, I can't even run water through without it burns me all the way to the top of my gully wash." His eyes, which were a strange, calm shade of gray, never left Roland's face. "What do you say, my good old mate?" "What happens to the rest of us if I hand over the boy?" "Why, you go on your way without no trouble from us. the man in the yellow headscarf returned promptly. You have the Tick-Tock man's word on that. It comes from his lips to my lips to your ears, so it does. The Tick-Tock's a trig cove, too. What don't break his word once it's been given. I can say airy word nor watch about any pubes you might run into, but you'll have no trouble with the Tick-Tock man's grays. The fuck are you saying, Roland? Eddie roared. You're not really thinking about doing it, are you? Roland didn't look down at Jake, and his lips didn't move as he murmured, I'll keep my promise. Yes, I know you will. Then Jake raised his voice and said, Put the gun away, Eddie. I'll decide. Jake, you're out of your mind, the pirate cackled cheerily. Not at all, Cully. You're the one who's lost his mind if you disbelieve me. At the very least, he'll be safe from the drums with us, won't he? And just think, if I didn't mean what I say, I would have told you to toss your guns overside first thing, easiest thing in the world. But did I? Nay. Susanna had heard the exchange between Jake and Roland. She had also had a chance to realize how bleak their options were as things now stood. Put it away, Eddie. How do we know you won't toss the grenade at us once you have the kid? Eddie called. I'll shoot it out of the air if he tries, Roland said. I can do it, and he knows I can do it. Mayhap I do. You got a cozy look about you, indeed you do. If he's telling the truth, Roland went on, he'd be burned even if I missed his toy because the bridge would collapse and we'd all go down together. Very clever, my dear old son, Gasher said. You are a cozy one, ain't you? He cawed laughter, then grew serious and confiding. The talking's done, old mate of mine. Decide. Will ye give me the boy, or do we all march to the end of the path together? Before Roland could say a word, Jake had slipped past him on the support rod. He still held Oy curled in his right arm. He held his bloody left hand stiffly out in front of him. Jake, no! Eddie shouted desperately. I'll come for you, Roland said in the same low voice. I know, Jake repeated. The wind gusted again. The bridge swayed and groaned. The sand was now speckled with whitecaps, and water boiled whitely around the wreck of the blue Mono jutting from the river on the upstream side. Aye, my cully, Gasher crooned, his lips spread wide, revealing a few remaining teeth that jutted from his white gums like decayed tombstones. Aye, my fine young squint, just keep comin'. Roland, he could be bluffing, Eddie yelled. That thing could be a dud. The gunslinger made no reply. As Jake neared the other side of the hole in the walkway, Oy bared his teeth and began to snarl at Gasher. Toss that talkin' bag of guts overside, Gasher said. Fuck you, Jake replied in the same calm voice. The pirate looked surprised for a moment, then nodded. Tender of 'em, are you? Very well. He took 2 steps backwards. Put him down the second you reach the concrete, then. And if he runs at me, I promise to kick his brains right out his tender little asshole. Asshole, Oy said through his bared teeth. Shut up, Oy, Jake muttered. He reached the concrete just as the strongest gust of wind yet struck the bridge. This time the twanging sound of parting cable strands seemed to come from everywhere. Jake glanced back and saw Roland and Eddie clinging to the rail. Susanna was watching him from over Roland's shoulder, her tight cap of curls rippling and shaking in the wind. Jake raised his hand to them. Roland raised his in return. You won't let me drop this time? He asked. No, not never again, Roland had replied. Jake believed him, but he was very much afraid of what might happen before Roland arrived. He put Oy down. Gasher rushed forward the moment he did, kicking out at the small animal. Oy skittered aside, avoiding the booted foot. Run! Jake shouted. Oy did, shooting past them and loping toward the lead end of the bridge, with his head down, swerving to avoid the holes and leaping across the cracks in the pavement. He didn't look back. A moment later, Gasher had his arm around Jake's neck. He stank of dirt and decaying flesh, the 2 odors combining to create a single deep stench, crusty and thick. It made Jake's gorge rise. He bumped his crotch into Jake's buttocks.
Maybe I ain't quite so far gone, I thought. Do you think youth's the wine that makes old men drunk? We'll have us a time, won't we, my sweet little Squint? Aye, we'll have a time such as will make the angels sing. Oh, Jesus, Drake thought. Gasher raised his voice again. We're leaving now, my hard case friend. We have grand things to do and grand people to see, so we do, but I keep my word. As for you, you'll stand right where you are for a good 15 minutes, if you're wise. If I see you start to move, we're all going to ride the hansom. Do you understand me? Yes, Roland said. Do you believe me when I say I have nothing to lose? Yes. It's very well, then. Move, boy. Huh. Gasher's hold tightened on Jake's throat until he could hardly breathe. At the same time, he was pulled backwards. They retreated that way, facing the gap where Roland stood with Susanna on his back and Eddie just behind him, still holding the Ruger, which Gasher had called a toy pistol. Jake could feel Gasher's breath puffing against his ear in hot little bursts. Worse, he could smell it. Don't try a thing, Gasher whispered, or I'll rip off your sweetmeats and stuff 'em up your bung. And chance to use 'em, wouldn't and it would be sad to lose 'em before you ever got a chance to use 'em, wouldn't it? Very sad indeed. They reached the end of the bridge. Jake stiffened, believing Gasher would throw the grenade away, but he didn't, at least not immediately. He backed Jake through a narrow alley between two small cubicles which had probably served as toll booths once upon a time. Beyond them the brick warehouses loomed like prison cell blocks. Now, Cully, I'm going to let go of your neck, or how would have ever have wind to run with. But I'll be holding your arm, and if you don't run like the wind, I promise I'll rip it right off and use it for a club to beat you with. Do you understand? Jake nodded, and suddenly the terrible stifling pressure was gone from his windpipe. As soon as it was, he became aware of his hand again. It felt hot and swollen and full of fire. Then Gasher seized his bicep with fingers like bands of iron, and he forgot all about his hand. Toodle-doo, Gasher called in a grotesquely cheery falsetto. He waggled the Granada at the others. Bye-bye, dears. Then he growled to Jake. Now, run, you whoring little squint, run! Jake was first whirled, then yanked into a run. The two of them went flying down a curved ramp to street level. Jake's first confused thought was that this was what the East River Drive would look like 200 or 300 years after some weird brain plague had killed all the sane people in the world. The ancient rusty hulks of what had once surely been automobiles stood at intervals along both curbs. Most were bubble-shaped roadsters that looked like no cars Jake had ever seen before, except maybe for the ones with the white-gloved creations of Walt Disney drove in the comic books. But among them he saw an old Volkswagen Beetle, a car that might have been a Chevrolet Corvair, and something he believed was a Model A Ford. There were no tires on any of these eerie hulks. They either had been stolen or had rotted away to dust long since, and all the glass had been broken, as if the remaining denizens of the city abhorred anything which might show them their own reflections, even accidentally. Beneath and between the abandoned cars, the gutters were filled with drips of unidentifiable metal junk and bright glints of glass. Trees had been planted at intervals along the sidewalks in some long-gone, happier time, but they were now so emphatically dead that they looked like stark metal sculptures against the cloudy sky. Some of the warehouses had either been bombed or had collapsed on their own, and beyond the jumbled heaps of bricks, which was all that remained of them, Jake could see the river and the rusty, sagging underpinnings of the Send Bridge. That smell of wet decay, the smell that seemed almost to snarl in the nose, was stronger than ever. The street headed due east, diverging from the path of the beam, and Jake could see it become more and more choked with rubble and rick-rack as it went. 6 or 7 blocks down, it appeared to be entirely plugged, but it was in this direction that Gasher pulled him. At first he kept up, but Gasher was setting a fearsome pace. Jake began to pant and fell a step behind. Gasher almost jerked him off his feet as he dragged Jake toward the barrier of junk and concrete and rusty steel beams which lay ahead. The plug, which looked like a deliberate construction to Jake, lay between two broad buildings with dusty marble facades. In front of the one on the left was a statue Jake recognized at once. It was the woman called Blind Justice, and that was almost surely made the building she guarded a courthouse. But he only had a moment to look. Gasher was dragging him relentlessly toward the barricade, and he wasn't slowing down. He'll kill us if he tries to take us through there, Jake thought. The Gasher, who ran like the wind in spite of his disease, which advertised itself on his face, simply buried his fingers deeper in Jake's upper arm and swept him along. And now Jake saw a narrow alley in the not quite haphazard pile of concrete, splintered furniture, rusted plumbing fixtures, and chunks of trucks and automobiles. He suddenly understood. This maze would hold Roland up for hours. But it was Gasher's backyard, and he knew exactly where he was going. The small dark opening to the alley was on the left side of the tottery pile of junk. As they reached it, Gasher tossed the green object back over his shoulder. "Better duck, dearie," he cried, and voiced a series of shrill, hysterical giggles. A moment later, a huge, crumping explosion shook the streets. One of the bumble-shaped cars jumped 20 feet into the air and then came back down on its roof. A hail of bricks whistled over Jake's head, and something thumped him hard on his left shoulder blade. He stumbled and would have fallen if Gasher hadn't yanked him upright and pulled him into the narrow opening in the rubble. Once they were in the passageway which lay beyond, gloomy shadows reached out eagerly and enfolded them. When they were gone, a small, furry shape crept out from behind a concrete boulder. It was Oi. He stood at the mouth of the passage for a moment, neck stretched forward, eyes gleaming. Then he followed after, nose low to the ground and sniffing carefully. "Come on," Roland said as soon as Gasher had turned tail. "How could you do it?" Eddie asked. "How could you let that freak have him?" "Because I had no choice. Bring the wheelchair, we're going to need it." They had reached the concrete on the far side of the gap when the explosion shook the bridge, spraying rubble into the darkening sky. "Christ," Eddie said, and turned his white, dismayed face to Roland. "Don't worry yet," Roland said calmly. "Fellows like Gasher rarely get careless with their high explosive toys." They reached the toll booths at the end of the bridge. Roland stopped just beyond the top of the curving ramp. "You knew the guy wasn't just bluffing, didn't you?" Eddie said. "I mean, you weren't guessing. You knew." "He's a walking dead man, and such men don't need to bluff." Roland's voice was calm enough, but there was a deep undertone of bitterness and pain in it. "I knew something like this could happen, and if we'd seen the fellow earlier, while we were still beyond the range of his exploding egg, we could have stood him off. But then Jake fell, and he got too close. I imagine he thinks our real reason for bringing a boy in the first place was to pay for safe conduct through the city. Damn the luck." Roland struck his fist against his leg. "Well, let's go get him." Roland shook his head. "This is where we split up. We can't take Susanna where the bastard's gone, and we can't leave her alone. But listen and don't argue. Not if you want to save Jake. The longer we stand here, the colder his trail gets. Cold trails are hard to follow. You've got your own job to do. If there's another Blaine, and I'm sure Jake believes there is, then you and Susanna must find it. There must be a station, or what was once called a cradle in the far lands. Do you understand?" For once, blessedly, Eddie didn't argue. "Yeah, we'll find it. What then?" "Fire shot every half hour or so. When I get Jake, I'll come." "Shots may attract other people as well," Susanna said. Eddie helped her out of the sling, and she was seated in her chair again. Roland surveyed them coldly. "Handle them." "Okay." Eddie stuck out his hand, and Roland took it briefly. "Find him, Roland." "Oh, I'll find him. Just pray to your gods that I find him soon enough. And remember the faces of your fathers, both of you." Susanna nodded. "We'll try." Roland turned and ran light-footed down the ramp. When he was out of sight, Eddie looked at Susanna and was not very surprised to see she was crying. He felt like crying himself. Half an hour ago they had been a tight little band of friends. Their comfortable fellowship had been smashed to bits in the space of just a few minutes. Jake abducted, Roland gone after him, even Oi had run away. Eddie had never felt so lonely in his life. I have a feeling we're never going to see either of them again, Susanna said. Of course we will, Eddie said roughly, but he knew what she meant, because he felt the same way. The premonition that their quest was all over before it was fairly begun lay heavy on his heart. In a fight with Attila the Hun, I'd give you 3-2 odds on Roland the Barbarian. Come on, Suze, we've got a train to catch. But where? She asked forlornly. I don't know. Maybe we should just find the nearest wise old elf and ask him, huh? What are you talking about, Edward Dean? Nothing, he said, and because that was so goddamn true, he thought he might burst into tears. He grasped the handles of her wheelchair and began to push it down the cracked and glass-littered ramp that led into the city of Lud. Jake quickly descended into a foggy world where the only landmarks were pain, his throbbing hand, the place on his upper arm where Gasher's fingers dug in like steel pegs, his burning lungs. Before they had gone far, these pains were first joined and then overmatched by a deep, burning stitch in his left side. He wondered if Roland was following after them. He also wondered how long Oy would be able to live in this world which was so unlike the plains and forests where all he had known. Which were all he had known until now. Then Gasher clouded him across the face, bloodying his nose, and the thought was lost in a red wash of pain. Come on, you little bastard. Move your sweet cheeks. Running as fast as I can, Jake gasped, and just managed to dodge a thick shard of glass which jutted like a long transparent tooth from the wall of a junk to his left. You better not be, because I'll knock you cold and drag you along the hair of your head if you are. Now hup, little bastard. Jake somehow forced himself to run faster. He'd gone into the alley with the idea that they must shortly reemerge onto the avenue, but he now reluctantly realized that wasn't going to happen. This was more than an alley. It was a camouflaged and fortified road leading even deeper into the country of the Greys. The tall, tottery walls which pressed in on them had been built from an exotic array of materials. Cars which had been partially or completely flattened by the chunks of granite and steel placed on top of them, marbled pillars, unknown factory machines which were dull red with rust, wherever they weren't still black with grease, a chrome and crystal fish as big as a private plane, with one cryptic word of high speech, delight, carefully incised into its scaly gleaming side, crisscrossing chains, each link as big as Jake's head, wrapped around mad jumbles of furniture that appeared to balance above them as precariously as circus elephants do on their tiny steel platforms. They came to a place where this lunatic path branched, and Gasher chose the left fork without hesitation. A little further along, 3 more alleyways, these so narrow they were almost tunnels, spoked off in various directions. This time Gasher chose the right-hand branching. The new path, which seemed to be formed by banks of rotting boxes and huge blocks of old paper that might once have been books or magazines, was too narrow for them to run in side by side. Gasher shoved Jake into the lead and began beating him relentlessly on the back to make him go faster. This how a steer must feel when it's driven down the chute into the slaughtering pen, Jake thought, and vowed that if he got out of this alive, he would never eat steak again. Run, my sweet little boy cunt, run! Jake soon lost all track of the twistings and turnings they made, and as Gasher drove him deeper and deeper into this jumble of torn steel, broken furniture, and cast-off machinery, he began to give up hope of rescue. Not even Roland would be able to find him now. If the gunslinger tried, he would become lost himself and wander the choked paths of this nightmare world until he died. Now they were going downhill, and the walls of the tightly packed paper had given way to ramparts of filing cabinets, jumbles of adding machines, and piles of computer gear. It was like running through some nightmarish Radio Shack warehouse. For almost a full minute, the wall flowing past on Jake's left appeared to be constructed solely of either TV sets or carelessly stacked video display terminals. They stared at him like the glazed eyes of dead men, and as the pavement beneath their feet continued to descend, Jake realized they were in a tunnel. The strip of cloudy sky overhead narrowed to a band, and the band narrowed to a ribbon, and the ribbon became a thread. They were in the gloomy netherworld, scurrying like rats through a gigantic trash midden. What if it all comes down on us? Jake wondered. But in his current state of aching exhaustion, this possibility did not frighten him as much. If the roof fell in, he would at least be able to rest. Gasher drove him as a farmer would a mule, striking his left shoulder to indicate a left turn and his right to indicate a right turn. When the course was straight on, he thumped Jake on the back of the head. Jake tried to dodge a jutting piece of pipe and didn't quite succeed. It whacked into one hip and sent him flailing across the narrow passage toward a snarl of glass and jagged boards. Gasher caught him and shoved him forward again. "Run, you clumsy squint! Can't you run? If it wasn't for the tick-tock man, I'd bugger you right here and cut your throat while I did it. So I would." Jake ran in a red daze where there was only pain and the frequent thud of Gasher's fists coming down on his shoulders or the back of his head. At last, when he was sure he could run no longer, Gasher grabbed him by the neck and yanked him to a stop so fiercely that Jake crashed into him with a strangled squawk. "Here's a tricky little bit," Gasher panted jovially. "Look straight ahead and you'll see two wires what cross in an X low to the ground. Do you see 'em?" At first Jake didn't. It was very gloomy here. Heaps of huge copper kettles were piled up to the left, and to the right were stacks of steel tanks that looked like scuba diving gear. Jake thought he could turn these latter into an avalanche with one strong breath. He swiped his forearm across his eyes, brushing away tangles of hair, and tried not to think about how he'd look with about 16 tons of those tanks piled on top of him. He squinted in the direction Gasher was pointing. Yes, he could make out, barely, two thin, silvery lines that looked like guitar or banjo strings. They came down from the opposite sides of the passageway and crossed about 2 feet above the pavement. "Crawl under, dear heart, and be ever so careful, for if you so much as twang one of those wires, half the steel cement puke in this city'll come down on your dear little head. Mine too, although I doubt if that'd disturb you much, would it? Now crawl." Jake shrugged out of his pack, lay down, and pushed it through the gap ahead of him. And as he eased his way under the thin taut wires, he discovered that he wanted to live a little longer after all. It seemed that he could actually feel all those tons of carefully balanced junk waiting to come down on him. These wires are probably holding a couple of carefully chosen keystones in place, he thought. If one of them breaks, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. His back brushed one of the wires, and high overhead something creaked. "Careful, Cully," Gasher almost moaned. "Be oh so careful." Jake pushed himself beneath the criss-crossing wires, using his feet and his elbows. His stinking, sweat-clogged hair fell in his eyes again, but he did not dare brush it away. "You're clear," Gasher grunted at last and slipped beneath the tripwires himself with the same ease of long practice. He stood up and snatched Jake's pack before Jake could reshoulder it. "What's in here, Cully?" he asked, undoing the straps and peering in. "Got any treats for your old pal? For the Gasher man loves his treaties, so he does." "There's nothing in there but—" Gasher's hand flashed out and rocked Jake's head back with a hard slap that sent a fresh spray of bloody froth flying from the boy's nose. "What'd you do that for?" Jake cried, hurt and outraged. "For telling me what my own beshitted eyes can see," Gasher yelled and cast Jake's pack aside. He bared his remaining teeth at the boy in a dangerous, terrible grin. "And for almost bringing the whole beshitted works down on us." He paused, then added in a quieter voice. "And, because I felt like it, I must admit that. Your stupid sheep's face puts me weary much in a slappin' temper, so it does." The grin widened, revealing his oozing, whitish gums, the sight Jake could have done without. "If your hard-case friend follows us this far, he'll have a surprise when he runs into those wires, won't he?" Gasher looked up, still grinning. "There's a city bus balanced up there some place, as I remember." Jake began to weep, tired, hopeless tears that cut through the dirt on his cheeks in narrow channels. Gasher raised an open, threatening hand. "Get moving, Cully, before I start crying myself. For a weary sentimental fellow is your old pal, so he is, and when he starts to grieve and mourn, a little slapping is the only thing to put a smile on his face again. Run." They ran. Gasher chose pathways leading deeper into the smelly, creaking maze, seemingly at random, indicating his choices with hand wax to the shoulders. At some point the sound of the drums began. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and for Jake it was the final straw. He gave up hope and thought alike, and allowed himself to descend wholly into the nightmare. Roland halted in front of the barricade which choked the streets from side to side and top to bottom. Unlike Jake, he had no hopes of emerging into the open on the other side. The buildings lying east of this point would be sentry-occupied islands emerging from an inland sea of trash, tools, artifacts, and booby traps, he had no doubt. Some of these leavings undoubtedly still remained where they had fallen 500 or 700 or 1,000 years ago, but Roland thought most of it had been dragged here by the Greys a piece at a time. The eastern portion of Lud had become, in fact, the castle of the Greys, and Roland was now standing outside its wall. He walked forward slowly and saw the mouth of a passageway half hidden behind a ragged cement boulder. There were footprints in the powdery dust, 2 sets, one big, one small. Roland started to get up, looked again, and squatted on his hunkers once more. Not 2 sets, but 3, the third marking the paws of a small animal. "Oi?" Roland called softly. For a moment there was no response, and then a single bark came from the shadows. Roland stepped into the passageway and saw gold-ringed eyes peering at him from around the first crooked corner. Roland trotted down to the bumbler. Oi, who still didn't like to come really close to anyone but Jake, backed up a step, then held his ground, looking anxiously up at the gunslinger. "Do you want to help me?" Roland asked. He could feel the dry red curtain that was battle fear at the edge of his consciousness, but this was not the time for it. The time would come, but for now he must not allow himself that inexpressible relief. "Help me find Jake?" "Ake," Oi barked, still watching Roland with anxious eyes. "Go on, then. Find him." Oi turned away at once and ran rapidly down the alley, nose skimming the ground. Roland followed, his eyes only occasionally flickering up to glance at Oi. Mostly he kept his gaze fixed on the ancient pavement, looking for a sign. "Jesus," Eddie said. "What kind of people are these guys?" They had followed the avenue at the base of the ramp for a couple of blocks, had seen the barricades, missing Roland's entry into the partially hidden passageway by less than a minute, which lay ahead, and had turned north onto the broad thoroughfare which reminded Eddie of Fifth Avenue. He hadn't dared to tell Susanna that. He was still too bitterly disappointed with this stinking, littered ruin of a city to articulate anything hopeful. Fifth Avenue led them into an area of large white stone buildings that reminded Eddie of the way Rome looked in the gladiator movies he had watched on TV as a kid. They were austere and, for the most part, still in good shape. He was pretty sure they had been public buildings of some sort, galleries, libraries, maybe museums. One with a big domed roof had cracked like a granite egg. Might have been an observatory, although Eddie had read someplace that astronomers like to be away from big cities because all the electric lights fucked up their stargazing. There were open areas between these imposing edifices, and although the grass and flowers which had once grown there had been choked off by weeds and tangles of underbrush, the area still had a stately feel, and Eddie wondered if it had once been the center of Lud's cultural life. Those days were long gone, of course. Eddie doubted if Gasher and his pals were very interested in the ballet or chamber music. He and Susanna had come to a major intersection from which 4 more broad avenues radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. At the hub of the wheel was a large paved square. Ringing it were loudspeakers on 40-foot steel posts. In the center of the square was a pedestal with the remains of a statue upon it. A mighty copper war-horse, green with verdigris, pawing its 4 legs at the air. The warrior who had once ridden this charger lay off to the side on the corroded shoulder, waving what looked like a machine gun in one hand and a sword in the other. His legs were still bowed around the shape of the horse he had once ridden, but his boots remained welded to the sides of his metal mount. "Gray's Die" was written across the pedestal in fading orange letters. Glancing down the radiating streets, Eddie saw more of the speaker poles. A few had fallen over, but most still stood, and each of these had been festooned with grisly garland of corpses. As a result, the square into which Fifth Avenue emptied, and the streets which led away were guarded by a small army of the dead. What kind of people are they? Eddie asked again. He didn't expect an answer, and Susanna didn't give one, but she could have. She'd had insights into the past of Roland's world before, but never one as clear and sure as this. All of her earlier insights, like those which had come to her in the river crossing, had had a haunting, visionary quality, like dreams. But what came now arrived in a single flash, and it was like seeing the twisted face of a dangerous maniac illuminated by a stroke of lightning. The speakers, the hanging bodies, the drums. She suddenly understood how they went together, as clearly as she understood how the heavy laden wagons passing through the river crossing on their way to Jimtown had been pulled by oxen rather than mules or horses. "Never mind this trash," she said, and her voice only quivered a little. "It's the train we want. Which way is it, do you think?" Eddie glanced up at the darkening sky and easily picked out the path of the beam in the rushing clouds. He looked back down and wasn't much surprised to see that the entrance to the street corresponding most closely to the path of the beam was guarded by a large stone turtle. Its reptilian head peered out from beneath the granite lip of its shell. Its deep-set eyes seemed to stare curiously at them. Eddie nodded toward it and managed a small, dry smile. "See the turtle of enormous girth." Susanna took a brief look of her own and nodded. He pushed her across the city square and into the street of the turtle. The corpses which lined it gave off a dry, cinnamony smell that made Eddie's stomach clench. Not because it was bad, but because it was actually rather pleasant. The sugar-spicy aroma of something a kid would enjoy shaking onto his morning toast. The street of the turtle was mercifully broad, and most of the corpses hanging from the speaker poles were little more than mummies, but Susanna saw a few which were relatively fresh, with flies still crawling busily across the blackening skin of their swollen faces, and maggots still squirming out of their decaying eyes, and below each speaker was a little drift of bones. "There must be thousands," Eddie said. "Men, women, and kids." "Yes." Susanna's calm voice sounded distant and strange to her own ears. "They've had a lot of time to kill, and they've used it to kill each other." "Bring on those wise fucking elves," Eddie said, and the laugh that followed sounded suspiciously like a sob. He thought he was at least beginning to fully understand what that innocuous phrase, "the world has moved on," really meant. What a breadth of ignorance and evil it covered. And what a depth. The speakers were a wartime measure, Susanna thought. Of course they were. God only knows which war or how long ago, but it must have been a doozy. The rulers of Lud used the speakers to make citywide announcements from some central bomb-proof location, a bunker like the one Hitler and his high command retreated to at the end of World War II. And in her ears, she could hear the voice of authority which had come rolling out of those speakers, could hear it as clearly as she heard the crack of the wagons passing through river crossing, as clearly as she had heard the crack of the whip above the backs of the straining oxen. "Ration centers A and D will be closed today. Please proceed to B, C, E, and F with proper coupons. Militia squads 9, 10, and 12 report to Senside. Aerial bombardment is likely between the hours of 8 and 10 of the clock. All non-combatant residents should report to their designated shelters. Bring your gas masks. Repeat, bring your gas masks." Announcements. Yes, and some garbled version of the news. A propagandized, militant version George Orwell would have called doublespeak. And in between the news bulletins and the announcements, squalling military music and exhortations to respect the fallen by sending more men and women into the red throat of the abattoir. Then the war had ended, and silence had fallen, for a while. But at some point the speakers had begun broadcasting again. How long ago? 100 years? 50? Did it matter? Susanna thought not. What mattered was that when the speakers were reactivated, the only thing they broadcast was a single tape loop, the loop with the drum track on it, and the descendants of the city's original residents had taken it for what? The voice of the turtle? The will of the beam?
Susanna found herself remembering the time she had asked her father, a quiet but deeply cynical man, if he believed there was a God in heaven who guided the course of human events. Well, he had said, I think it's sort of half and half, Odetta. I'm sure there's a God, but I don't think he has much of anything to do with us these days. I believe that after we killed his son, he finally got it through his head that there wasn't nothing to be done with the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve, and he washed his hands of us. Wise fellow. She had responded to this, which she had fully expected. She was 11 at the time and knew the turn of her father's mind quite well, by showing him a squib of the community church's page on the local newspaper. It said that Reverend Murdoch of the Grace Methodist Church would that Sunday elucidate on the topic, God speaks to each of us every day, with a text from the 1st Corinthians. Her father had laughed over that so hard that tears had squirted from the corners of his eyes. Well, I guess each of us hears someone talking, he said at last, and you can bet your bottom dollar on one thing, sweetie. Each of us, including this here Reverend Murdoch, hears that voice say just exactly what he wants to hear. It's so convenient that way. What these people had apparently wanted to hear in the recorded drum track was an invitation to commit ritual murder. And now, when the drums began to throb through these hundreds or thousands of speakers, a hammering backbeat which was only the percussion to a ZZ Top song called Velcro Fly, if Eddie was right, it became their signal to unlimber the hang ropes and run a few folks up the nearest speaker posts. I'm so sorry, one moment. So sorry about that. I usually like to turn my phone off and ignore it, but I can't these days, and there's a lot of calls I have to take these days, and my apologies. Let me just take a minute to find where I was. Okay. It became their signal to unlimber the hang ropes and run a few folks up the nearest speaker posts. How many? She wondered as Eddie rolled her along in the wheelchair, its nicked and dented hard rubber tires cracking over broken glass and whispering through the drifts of discarded paper. How many have been killed over the years because some electric circuit under the city got the hiccups? Did it start because they recognized the essential alienness of the music which came somehow, like us, and the airplane and some of the cars along these streets, from another world? She didn't know, but she knew he'd come around to her father's cynical point of view on the subject of God and the chats he might or might not have with the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. These people had been looking for a reason to slaughter each other, that was all, and the drums had been as good a reason as any. She found herself thinking of the hive they had found, the misshapen hive of white bees whose honey would have poisoned them if they had been foolish enough to eat it. Here on this side of the Send was another dying hive. More mutated white bees whose sting would be no less deadly for their confusion, loss, and perplexity. And how many more will have to die before the tape finally breaks? As if her thoughts had caused it to happen, the speakers suddenly began to transmit the relentless, syncopated heartbeat of the drums. Eddie yelled in surprise. Susanna screamed and clapped both hands to her ears, but before she did, she could faintly hear the rest of the music. The track, or tracks, which had been muted decades ago when somebody, probably quite by accident, had bumped the balance control, knocking it all the way to one side and burying both the guitars and the vocal. Eddie continued to push her along. The street of the turtle and the path of the beam, trying to look in all directions at once and trying not to smell the odor of putrefaction. Thank God for the wind, he thought. He began to push the wheelchair faster, scanning the weedy gaps between the big white buildings for the graceful sweep of an overhead monorail track. He wanted to get out of this endless aisle of the dead. As he took yet another deep breath of that spaciously sweet cinnamon smell, it seemed to him that he had never wanted anything so badly in his whole life. Jake's daze was broken abruptly when Gasher grabbed him by the collar and yanked him with all the force of a cruel rider breaking a galloping horse. He stuck one leg out at the same time, and Jake went crashing backward over it. His head connected with the pavement, and for a moment all the lights went out. Gasher, no humanitarian, brought him around quickly by seizing Jake's lower lip and yanking it upward and outward. Jake screamed and bolted to a sitting position, striking out blindly with his fists. Gasher dodged the blows easily, hooked his other hand in Jake's armpit, and yanked him to his feet. Jake stood there, rocking drunkenly back and forth. He was beyond protest now, almost beyond understanding. All he knew for sure was that every muscle in his body felt sprung, and his wounded hand was howling like an animal caught in a trap. Gasher apparently needed a breather, and this time he was slower getting his wind back. He stood bent over with his hands planted on the knees of his green trousers, panting in fast little whistling breaths. His yellow headscarf had slipped askew. His good eye glittered like a trumpery diamond. The white silk eye patch was now wrinkled, and curds of evil-looking yellow muck oozed onto his cheek from beneath it. "Take a look over your head, Cully, and you'll see why I bring you up short. Get an eyeful." Jake tilted his head upward, and in the depths of his shock, he was not at all surprised to see a marble fountain as big as a house trailer dangling 80 feet above them. He and Gasher were almost below it. The fountain was held suspended by 2 rusty cables, which were mostly hidden within huge unsteady stacks of church pews. Even in his less than acute state, Jake saw that these cables were more seriously frayed than the remaining hangers on the bridge he had been. "See it?" Gasher asked, grinning. He raised his left hand to his covered eye, scooped a mass of the pussy material from beneath it, and flicked it indifferently aside. "Beauty, ain't it? Oh, the Tick-Tock man's a trig cove, all right, and no mistake. Where's those goat-fucking drums? They should have started by now. If Copperhead's forgot 'em, I'll ram a stick so far up his ass he'll taste bark. Now look ahead of you, my delicious little squint." Jake did, and Gasher immediately clouded him so hard that he staggered backward and almost fell. "Not across, idiot child, down. See them 2 dark cobblestones?" After a moment Jake did. He nodded apathetically. "You don't want to step on 'em, for that'd bring the whole works down on your head, Cully. And anybody who wanted yer after have to pick yer up with a blotter, understand?" Jake nodded again. "Good." Gasher took a final deep breath and slapped Jake's shoulder. "Go on, then. What you waiting for? Hup." Jake stepped over the first of the discolored stones and saw it was really wasn't a cobblestone at all, but a metal plate which had been rounded to look like one. The second was just ahead of it, cunningly placed so that if an unaware intruder happened to miss the first one, he or she would almost certainly step on the second. "Go ahead and do it, then," he thought. "Why not? The gunslinger's never going to find you in this maze, so go ahead
and bring it down. It's got to be cleaner than what Gasher and his friends have got planned for you. Quicker, too. His dusty moccasin wavered in the air above the booby trap. Gasher hit him with a fist in the middle of the back, but not so hard. Thinking about taking a ride, handsome, are you, my little Cole? He asked. The laughing cruelty in his voice had been replaced by simple curiosity. If it was tinged with any other emotion, it wasn't fear, but amusement. Well, go ahead, if it's what you mean to do, for I have my ticket already. Only be quick about it. Gods blast your eyes. Jake's foot came down beyond the trigger of the booby trap. His decision to live it a little longer was not based on any hope that Roland would find him. It was just that this was what Roland would do. Go on until someone made him stop. And then a few yards further still, if he could. If he did it now, he could take Gasher with him, but Gasher alone wasn't sufficient. One look enough to make it clear that he was telling the truth when he said he was dying already. If he went on, he might have a chance to take some of the Gasherman's friends, too, maybe even the one he called the TikTok man. If I'm going to ride what he calls the handsome, Jake thought, I'd just as soon go with plenty of company. Roland would have understood. Jake was wrong in his assessment of the gunslingers' ability to follow their path through the maze. Jake's pack was only the most obvious bit of sign they left behind them, but Roland quickly realized he did not have to pause to look for sign. He had only to follow Oi. He paused at several intersecting passages, nevertheless, waiting to make sure, and each time he did, Oi looked back and uttered his low, impatient bark that seemed to say, "Hurry up, do you want to lose them?" After the signs he saw a track, a thread from Jake's shirt, a scrap of a bright yellow cloth from Gasher's scarf, and 3 times, confirmed the bumbler's choice, Roland simply followed Oi. He did not give up looking for sign, but he quit making stops to hunt for it. Then the drums started up, and it was the drums plus Gasher's noisiness about what Jake might be carrying that saved Roland's life that afternoon. He skidded to a halt in his dusty boots, and his gun was in his hand before he realized what the sound was. When he did realize, he dropped the revolver back into its holster and with an impatient grunt. He was about to go on again when his eye happened first on Jake's pack, and then on a pair of faint, gleaming streaks in mid-air just to the left of it. Roland narrowed his eyes and made out 2 thin wires which crisscrossed at knee level, not 3 feet in front of him. Oi, who was built low to the ground, had scurried neatly through the inverted V formed by the wires, but if not for the drums and spotting Jake's cast-off pack, Roland would have run right into them. As his eyes moved upward, tracing the not quite random piles of junk poised on either side of the passageway at this point, Roland's mouth tightened. It had been a close call. Call, and only Ka had saved him. Oi barked impatiently. Roland dropped to his belly and crawled beneath the wires, moving slowly and carefully. He was bigger than either Jake or Gasher, and he realized a really big man wouldn't have been able to get under here at all without triggering that carefully prepared avalanche. The drums pumped and thumped in his ears. I wonder if they've all gone mad, he thought. If I had to listen to that every day, I think I would have. He got to the far side of the wires, picked up the pack, and looked inside. Jake's books and a few items of clothing were still in there. So were the treasures he had picked up along the way. A rock which gleamed with yellow flecks that looked like gold but weren't. An arrowhead, probably the leaving of the old forest folk, which Jake had found in a grove of trees the day after his drawing. Some coins from his own world. His father's sunglasses. A few other things which only a boy not yet in his teens could really love and understand. Things he would want back again. If that was, Roland got to him before Gasher and his friends could change him, hurt him in ways that would cause him to lose interest in the innocent pursuit and curiosities of pre-adolescent boyhood. Gasher's grinning face swam into Roland's mind like the face of a demon or a djinn from a bottle, the snaggled teeth, the vacant eyes, the mandrus crawling over the cheeks and spreading beneath the stubby lines of the jaw. If you hurt him, he thought, and then forced his mind away because that line of thought was a blind alley. If Gasher hurt the boy, Jake, his mind insisted fiercely, not just the boy, but Jake. Roland would kill him, yes, but the act would mean nothing, for Gasher was a dead man already. The gunslinger lengthened the straps of the pack, marveling at the clever buckles which made this possible, slipping it onto his own back, and stood up again. Oy turned to be off, but Roland called his name, and the bumbler looked back. To me, Oy. Roland didn't know if the bumbler could understand, or if he would obey even if he did, but it would be better, safer, if he stayed close. Where there was one booby trap, there were apt to be more. Next time, Oy might not be so lucky. Ache! Oy barked, not moving. The bark was assertive, but Roland thought he saw more of the truth about how Oy felt in his eyes. They were dark with fear. Yes, but it's dangerous, Roland said. To me, Oy. Back the way they had come, there was a thud as something heavy fell, probably dislodged by the punishing vibration of the drums. Roland could now see speaker poles here and there poking out from the wreckage like strange long-necked animals. Oy trotted back to him and looked up, panting. Stay close. Ache! 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 Yes, Jake. He began to run again, and Oy ran beside him, heeling as neatly as any dog Roland had ever seen. For Eddie, it was, as some wise man had once said, déjà vu all over again. He was running with the wheelchair, racing time. The beach had been replaced by the street of the Turtle, but somehow everything else was the same. Oh, there was one other relevant difference. Now it was a railway station, or a cradle he was looking for, not a freestanding door. Susanna was sitting bolt upright with her hair blowing out behind her and Roland's revolver in her right hand, its barrel pointed up at the cloudy, troubled sky. The drums thudded and pounded, bludgeoning them with sound. The gigantic dish-shaped object lay in the street just ahead, and Eddie's overstrained mind, perhaps cued by the classical buildings on either side of them, produced an image of Jove and Thor playing frisbee. Jove throws one wide, and Thor lets it fall through a cloud. What the hell? It's Miller time on Olympus anyway. Frisbees of the gods, he thought, swerving Susanna between two crumbling, rusting cars. What a concept. He bumped the chair up on the sidewalk to get around the artifact, which looked like some sort of telecommunications dish now that he was really close to it. He was easing the wheelchair over the curb and back into the street again. The sidewalk was too littered with crap to make any real time, when the drums suddenly cut out. The echoes rolled away into new silence, except it wasn't really silent at all, Eddie realized. Up ahead, the arched entrance to the marble building stood at the intersection of the Street of the Turtle and another avenue. This building had been overgrown by vines and some straggly green stuff that looked like cypress beards, but it was still magnificent and somehow dignified. Beyond it, around the corner, a crowd was babbling excitedly. Don't stop, Susanna snapped. We haven't got time to. A hysterical shriek drilled through the babble. It was accompanied by yells of approval and incredibly, the sort of applause Eddie had heard in Atlantic City hotel casinos after some lounge act had finished doing its thing. The shriek was choked into a long, dying gargle that sounded like the buzz of a cicada. Eddie felt the hair on the nape of his neck coming to attention. He glanced at the corpses hanging from the nearest speaker pole and understood that the fun-loving pubes of Ludd were holding another public execution. Marvelous, he thought. Now, if they only had Tony Orlando and Dawn to sing Knock 3 times, they could all die happily. Eddie looked curiously at the stone pile on the corner. This close, the vines which overgrew it had a powerful herbal smell. The smell was eye-wateringly bitter, but he still liked it better than the cinnamon-sweet odor of the mummified corpses. The beards of greenery growing from the vines drooped in ratty sheaves, creating waterfalls of vegetation where once there had been a series of arched entrances. A figure suddenly barreled out through one of these waterfalls and hurried toward them. It was a kid, Eddie realized, and not that many years out of a diaper, judging by the size. He was wearing a weird little Lord Fauntleroy outfit, complete with ruffled white shirt and velveteen short pants. There were ribbons in his hair. Eddie felt a sudden mad urge to wave his hands above his head and scream, "But we'd say, Lud is ote." "Come on, Come on, the kid cried in a high, piping voice. Several sprays of the green stuff had gotten caught in his hair. He brushed absently at these with his left hand as he ran. They're going to do spankers. It's the spanker man's turn to go to the land of the drums. Come on, you'll miss the whole segment. God's cuss it. Susanna was equally stunned by the child's appearance, but as he got closer it struck her that there was something extremely odd and awkward about the way he was brushing at the crumbles and strands of greenery which had gotten caught in his beribboned hair. He kept using just that one hand. His other hand had been behind his back when he ran through the weedy waterfall, and there it remained. How awkward that must be, she thought. And then a tape player turned on in her mind, and she heard Roland speaking at the end of the bridge. I knew something like this could happen. If we'd seen the fellow earlier, while we were still beyond the range of his exploding egg, damn the luck. She leveled Roland's gun at the child, who had leaped from the curb and was running straight for them. Hold it, she screamed. Stand still, you! Suze, what are you doing? Eddie yelled. Susanna ignored him. In a very real sense, Susanna Dean was no longer even here. It was Detta Walker in the chair now, and her eyes were glittering with feverish suspicion. Stop or I'll shoot! Little Lord Fauntleroy might have been deaf for all the effect her warning had. Huss it, she shouted jubilantly. You're going to miss the whole show. Spanker's going to... His right hand finally began to come out from behind his back. As it did, Eddie realized they weren't looking at a kid, but a misshapen dwarf whose childhood was many years past. The expression Eddie had at first taken for childish glee was actually a chilly mixture of hate and rage. The dwarf's cheeks and brow were covered with oozing discolored patches Roland called whore's blossoms. Susanna never saw his face. Her attention was fixed on the emerging right hand and the dull green sphere it held. That was all she needed to see. Roland's gun crashed. The dwarf was hammered backward. A shrill cry of pain and rage rose from his tiny mouth as he landed on the sidewalk. The grenade bounced out of his hand and rolled back into the same arch through which he had emerged. Detta was gone like a dream, and Susanna looked from the smoking gun to the tiny sprawled figure on the sidewalk with surprise, horror, and dismay. Oh, my Jesus, I shot him. Eddie, I shot him. Graze! Die! Little Lord Fauntleroy tried to scream these words defiantly, but they came out in a bubbling choke of blood that drenched the few remaining white patches on his frilly shirt. There was a muffled explosion from inside the overgrown plaza of the corner building, and the shaggy carpets of the green stuff hanging in front of the arches billowed outward like flags in a brisk gale. With them came clouds of choking, acrid smoke. Eddie flung himself on top of Susanna to shield her and felt a gritty shower of concrete fragments, all small ones, luckily, patter down on his back, his neck, and the crown of his head. There was a series of unpleasantly wet smacking sounds to his left. He opened his eyes a crack and looked in that direction and saw little Lord Fauntleroy's head just coming to a stop in the gutter. The dwarf's eyes were still open, his mouth still fixed in its final snarl. Now there were other voices, some shrieking, some yelling, all furious. Eddie rolled off Susanna's chair. It tottered on one wheel before deciding to stay up, and stared in the direction from which the dwarf had come. A ragged mob of about 20 men and women had appeared, some coming from around the corner, others pushing through the mats of foliage which obscured the corner building arches, materializing from the smoke of the dwarf's grenade like evil spirits. Most were wearing blue headscarves, and all were carrying weapons, a varied and somehow pitiful assortment of them, which included rusty swords, dull knives, and splintery clubs. Eddie saw one man defiantly waving a hammer. Pubes, Eddie thought. We interrupted their necktie party, and they're pissed as hell about it. A tangle of shouts. Kill the Greys! Kill them both! They've done for Luster! God, kill their eyes! Arose from the charming group as they caught sight of Susanna in her wheelchair and Eddie, who was now crouched on one knee before it. The man in the forefront was wearing a kilt-like wrap and waving a cutlass. He brandished this wildly. He would have decapitated the heavy-set woman standing close behind him had she not ducked, and then charged. The others followed, yelling happily. Roland's gun pounded its bright thunder into the windy, overcast day, and the top of the kilt-wearing Pube's head lifted off. The sallow skin of the woman who had almost been decapitated by his cutlass was suddenly striped with red, and she voiced a sound of barking dismay. The others came on past the woman and the dead man, raving and wild-eyed. "Eddie!" Susanna screamed and fired again. A man wearing a silk-lined cape and knee boots collapsed into the streets. Eddie groped for the Ruger and had one panicky moment when he thought he had lost it. The butt of the gun had somehow slipped down the side of the waistband of his pants. He wrapped his hand around it and yanked hard. The fucking thing wouldn't come. The sight at the end of the barrel had somehow gotten stuck in his underwear. Susanna fired 3 closely spaced shots. Each found a target, but the oncoming Pubes didn't slow. "Eddie, help me!" Eddie tore his pants open, feeling like some cut-rate version of Superman, and finally managed to free the Ruger. He hit the safety with the heel of his left palm, placed his elbow on his leg just above the knee, and began to fire. There was no need to think, no need to even aim. Roland had told them that in battle a gunslinger's hands worked on their own, and Eddie now discovered that it was true. It would have been hard for a blind man to miss at this range anyway. Susanna had cut the numbers of the charging Pubes to no more than 15. Eddie went through the remainder like a storm wind in a wheat field, dropping 4 in less than 2 seconds. Now the single face of the mob, that look of glazed and mindless eagerness, began to break apart. The man with the hammer abruptly tossed his weapon aside and ran for it, limping extravagantly on a pair of arthritis-twisted legs. He was followed by 2 others. The rest of them milled uncertainly in the street. "Come on, you doocies," a relatively young man snarled. He wore his blue scarf around his throat like a rally racer's ascot. He was bald except for 2 fluffs of frizzy red hair, one on each side of his head. To Susanna, this fellow looked like Clarabelle the clown. To Eddie, he looked like Ronald McDonald. To both of them, he looked like trouble. He threw a homemade spear that might have started its life as a steel table leg. It clattered harmlessly into the street, to Eddie and Susanna's right. "Come on, I say. We can get him if we all stick together." "Sorry, guy," Eddie murmured, and shot him in the chest. Clarabelle/Ronald staggered backward, one hand going to his shirt. He stared at Eddie with huge eyes that told his tale with heartbreaking clarity. This wasn't supposed to happen. The hand dropped heavily to the young man's side. A single runlet of blood, incredibly bright in the gray day, slipped from the corner of his mouth. The few remaining Pubes stared at him mutely as he slipped to his knees, and one of them turned to run. "Not at all," Eddie said. "Stay put, my retarded friend, or you're going to get a good look at the clearing where the path ends." He raised his voice. "Drop 'em, boys and girls, all of 'em, now." "You," the dying man whispered. "You, gunslinger." "That's right," Eddie said. His eyes surveyed the remaining Pubes grimly. "Cry your pardon," the man with the frizzy red hair gasped, and then he fell forward onto his face. "Gunslingers?" one of the others asked. His tone was one of dawning horror and realization. "Well, you're stupid, but you ain't deaf," Susanna said. "And that's something, anyway." She waggled the barrel of the gun, which Eddie was quite sure was empty. For that many, how many rounds could be left in the Ruger? He realized he didn't have any idea how many rounds the clip held, and cursed himself for a fool, but he really believed it could. But had he really believed it could come to something like this? He didn't think so. "You heard him, folks. Drop him. Recess is over." One by one, they complied. The woman, who was wearing a pint or so of Mr. Sword and Kilt's blood on her face, said, "You shouldn't have killed Winston, missus. 'Twas his birthday, so it was." "Well, I guess he should have stayed home and eaten some more birthday cake," Eddie said. Given the overall quality of this experience, he didn't find either the woman's comment or his own response at all surreal. There was one other woman among the remaining Pubes, a scrawny thing whose long blonde hair was coming out in big patches, as if she had the mange. Eddie observed her sidling toward the dead dwarf, and the potential safety of the overgrown arches beyond him, and put a bullet into the cracked cement close by her foot. He had no idea what he wanted with her, but what he didn't want was for one of them giving the rest of them ideas. For one thing, he was afraid of what his hands might do if the sickly, sullen people before him tried to run. Whatever his head thought about this gunslinging business, his hands discovered they liked it just fine. "Stand where you are, beautiful. Officer Friendly says play it safe." He glanced at Susanna and was disturbed by the grayish quality of her complexion. "Suze, you all right?" he asked in a lower voice. "Yes." "You're not going to faint or anything, are you? Because—" "No." She looked at him with eyes so dark they were like caves. "It's just that I never shot anyone before. Okay?" "Well, you better get used to it," rose to his lips. He bit it back and returned his gaze to the 5 people who remained before them. They were looking at him and Susanna with a species of sullen fear which nevertheless stopped well short of terror. Shit, most of them have forgotten what terror is, he thought. Joy, sadness, love, same thing. I don't think they feel much of anything anymore. They've been living in this purgatory too long. Then he remembered the laughter, the excited cries, the lounge act applause, and revised his thinking. There was at least one thing that still got their motors running. One thing that still pushed their buttons. Spanker could have testified to that. "Who's in charge here?" Eddie asked. He was watching the intersection behind the little group very carefully in case the others should get their courage back. So far, he saw and heard nothing alarming from that direction. He thought that the others had probably left this ragged crew to its fate. They looked at each other uncertainly, and finally the woman with the blood-splattered face spoke up. "Spanker was. But when the goddamn drums started up this time, it was Spanker's stone what came out of the hat, and we set him to dance. I guess Winston would have come next, but you did for him with your gold-rotted guns, didn't you? Oh, but you did him with your gold-rotted guns, so you did." She wiped blood deliberately from her cheek, looked at it, then returned her sullen glance to Eddie. "Well, what'd you think Winston was trying to do to me with his god-rotted spear?" Eddie asked. He was disgusted to find the woman had actually made him feel guilty about what he had done. "Trim my sideburns?" "Killed Frank and Luster, too," she went on doggedly. "And what are you? Either Greys, which is bad, or a couple of god-rotted outlanders, which is worse. Who's left for the pubes in City North? Topsy, I suppose, Topsy the sailor. But he ain't here, is he? Took his boat and went off down river. Aye, so he did, and God rot him too, says I." Susanna had ceased listening. Her mind had fixed with horrid fascination on something the woman had said earlier. It was Spanker's stone what came out of the hat, and we sent him to dance. She remembered reading Shirley Jackson's story, The Lottery, in college, and understood that these people, the degenerate descendants of the original pubes, were living Jackson's nightmare. No wonder they weren't capable of any strong emotion when they knew they would have to participate in such grisly drawing not once a year, as in the story, but 2 or 3 times each day. "Why?" she asked the bloody woman in a harsh, horrified voice. "Why do you do it?" The woman looked at Susanna as if she was the world's biggest fool. "Why? So the ghosts what live in the machines won't take over the bodies of those who have died here, pubes and greys alike, and send them up through the holes in the streets to eat us. Any fool knows that." "There was no such thing as ghosts," Susanna said, and her voice sounded like so much meaningless quacking to her own ears. "Of course there were. In this world, there were ghosts everywhere. Nevertheless," she pushed ahead, what you call the god drums is only a tape stuck in a machine. That's really all it is." Sudden inspiration struck her, and she added, "Or maybe the Greys are doing it on purpose. Did you ever think of that? They live in the other part of the city, don't they? And under it as well. They've always wanted you out. Maybe they just hit on a really efficient way of getting you guys to do their work for them." The bloody woman was standing next to the elderly Ghent, wearing what looked like the world's oldest bowler hat and a pair of frayed khaki shorts. Now he stepped forward and spoke to her with a patina of good manners that turned his underlying contempt into a dagger with razor-sharp edges. You are quite wrong, Madam Gunslinger. There are a great many machines under Lud, and there are ghosts in all of them, demoness spirits which bear only ill will to mortal men and women. These demon ghosts are very capable of raising the dead, and in Lud there are a great many dead to raise. Listen, Eddie said. Have you ever seen one of these zombies with your own eyes, Jeeves? Have any of you? Jeeves curled his lips and said nothing, but the lip curl really said it all. What else could one expect, it asked, for the Outlanders who used guns as substitute for understanding? Eddie decided it would be best to close off the whole line of discussion. He had never been cut out for missionary work anyway. He waggled the Ruger at the blood-stained woman. You and your friend there, the one who looks like an English butler on his day off, are going to take us to the railroad station. After that, we can all say goodbye, and I'll tell you the truth, that's going to make my fucking day. Railroad station? The guy who looked like Jeeves, the butler, asked. What is a railroad station? Take us to the cradle, Susanna said. Take us to Blaine. This finally rattled Jeeves. An expression of shocked horror replaced the world-weary contempt with which he had thus far treated them. You can't go there, he cried. The cradle is forbidden ground, and Blaine is the most dangerous of all Lud's ghosts. Forbidden ground? Eddie thought. Great. If it's the truth, at least we'll be able to stop worrying about you assholes. It was also nice to hear that there still was a Blaine, or that these people thought there was anyway. The others were staring at Eddie and Susanna with their expressions of uncomprehending amazement. It was as if the interlopers had suggested to a bunch of born-again Christians that they hunt up the Ark of the Covenant and turn it into a pay toilet. Eddie raised the Ruger until the center of Jeeves' forehead lay in its sights. We're going, he said. And if you don't want to join your ancestors right here and now, I suggest you stop pissing and moaning and take us there. Jeeves and the blood-stained woman exchanged an uncertain glance, but when the man in the bowler hat looked back at Eddie and Susanna, his face was firm and set. Shoot us if you like, he said. We'd sooner die here than there. You folks are a bunch of sick motherfuckers with dying on the brain, Susanna cried at them. Nobody has to die. Just take us where we want to go, for the love of God. The woman said somberly, But it is death to enter Blaine's cradle, Mum. So it is. For Blaine sleeps, and he who deserves his rest must pay a high price. Come on, beautiful, Eddie snapped. You can't smell the coffee with your head up your ass. I don't know what that means, she said with an odd and perplexing dignity. It means you can take us to the cradle and risk the wrath of Blaine, or you can stand your ground here and experience the wrath of Eddie. It doesn't have to be a nice clean headshot, you know. I can take you a piece at a time, and I'm feeling just mean enough to do it. I'm having a very bad day in your city. The music sucks. Everybody has a bad case of BO. The first guy we saw threw a grenade at us and kidnapped our friend. So what do you say? Why would you go to Blaine in any case? One of the others asked. He stirs no more from his birth in the cradle, not for years now. He has even stopped speaking in his many voices and laughing. Speaking in his many voices and laughing, Eddie thought. He looked at Susanna. She looked back and shrugged. Artist was the last to go nigh Blaine, the blood-stained woman said. Jeeves nodded somberly. Artist always was a fool when he were in drink. Blaine asked him some questions, I heard it, but it made no sense to me. Something about the mother of ravens, I think. And when Artist couldn't answer the question what was asked, Blaine slew him with blue fire. Electricity? Eddie asked. Jeeves and the blood-stained woman both nodded. Aye, the woman said, electricity, so it were called in the old days, so it were. You don't have to go on with us, Susanna proposed suddenly. Just get us within sight of the place. We'll go the rest of the way on our own. The woman looked at her mistrustfully, and then Jeeves pulled her head close to his lips and mumbled in her ear for a while. The other pews stood behind them in a ragged line, looking at Eddie and Susanna with the dazed eyes of people who have survived a bad air raid. At last the woman looked around. Aye, she said. We'll take you nigh the cradle, and then it's good riddance to bad swill. My idea exactly, Eddie said. You and Jeeves, the rest of you, scatter. He swept them with his eyes. But remember this. One spear thrown from ambush, one arrow, one brick, and these two die. This threat came out sounding so weak and pointless that Eddie wished he hadn't made it. How could they possibly care for these two, or for any of the individual members of their clan, when they dusted 2 or more of them each day and every day? Well, he thought, watching the others trot off without so much as a backward glance, it was too late to worry about that now. Come on, the woman said. I want to be done with you. The feeling's mutual, Eddie replied. But before she and Jeeves led them away, the woman did something which made Eddie repent a little for his hard thoughts. Knelt, brushed back the hair of the man in the kilt, and placed a kiss on his dirty cheek. Goodbye, Winston, she said. Wait for me where the tree's clear and the water's sweet. I'll come to ye, as sure as dawn makes shadows run west. I didn't want to kill him, Susanna said. I want you to know that. But I wanted to die even less. Aye. The face that turned toward Susanna was stern and tearless. But if you mean to enter Blaine's cradle, you'll die anyway. And the chances are that you'll die envying poor old Winston. He's cruel, this Blaine, the cruelest of all the demons in this cruel, cruel place. Come on, Maud, Jeeves said and helped her up. Aye, let's finish with them. She surveyed Susanna and Eddie again, her eyes stern but somehow confused as well. God's curse my eyes that they should ever have happened on you two in the first place, and God's curse the guns ye carry as well, for they were always the springhead of our troubles. And with that attitude, Susanna thought, your troubles are going to last at least 1,000 years, sugar. Maud set a rapid pace along the street of the Turtle. Jeeves trotted beside her. Eddie, who was pushing Susanna in the wheelchair, was soon panting and struggling to keep up. The palatial buildings which lined their way spread out until they resembled ivy-covered country houses on huge run-to-riot lawns, and Eddie realized they had entered what had once been a very ritzy neighborhood indeed. Ahead of them, one building loomed above all the others. It was deceptively simple square construction of white stone blocks, its overhanging roof supported by many pillars. Eddie thought again of the gladiator movies he'd so enjoyed as a kid. Susanna, educated in more formal schools, was reminded of the Parthenon. Both saw and marveled at the gorgeously sculpted bestiary, bear and turtle, fish and rat, horse and dog, which ringed the top of the buildings in a 2x2 parade, and understood it was the place they had come to find. That uneasy sensation that they were being watched by many eyes filled equally with hate and wonder, never left them. Thunder boomed as they came in sight of the monorail track. Like the storm, the track came sweeping in from the south, joined the street of the Turtle, and ran straight on toward the cradle of Lud. And as they neared it, ancient bodies began to twist and dance in the strengthening wind on the side of them. After they had run, for God knew how long, all Jake knew for sure was that the drums had stopped again, Gasher once more yanked him to a stop. This time, Jake managed to keep his feet. He had gotten his second wind. Gasher, who would never see 11 again, had not. Oh, my old do a nip up, sweetie. I don't know what sparked this latest round of curiosity from the dogs, but I guess we're gonna go ahead and stop there, and we will pick up again next week. It's a good place to stop anyway. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for dropping by. All that good stuff. Sorry I've been missing lately because life got crazy this year for no reason, but I will do my best to maintain some regularity. And I will see you guys for book club again next weekend. Later days, pretty shiny peoples. Do not forget to smile and have bunches of fun. Bye-bye.